So again, thank you very much for coming along. We've got a day to talk about accounting for the environment. And yeah, so I'm hoping that through the course, I've got a lot of slides here. But I'm actually hoping that we can have quite a lot of some interaction and discussion about things to try and get across some of the basic the way of thinking about things when you want to try and account for the environment in a more holistic type of way. And it does require well, no, it doesn't require, but it works really well if you can sort of set aside things and try and reframe the world a little bit for yourselves. You can still hold on to everything you already know, but if you reframe it a little bit, you can get the most. There's real opportunities there. So hopefully we can get that across through the course of the day. So by way of background, my name is Carl Obst. I economist by training, did a degree at the University of New England in Armidale in New South Wales, Australia. Ended up at the Australian Bureau of Statistics after that and spent about, I don't know, 15 or 20 years in national accounts and 5 years as head of national accounts in Australia. And then a little bit of a stint at the OECD during that time. And then in 2010, I got invited by the UN to play the role of editor of the SEIA, System of Environmental Economic Accounting revision process. So that was in 2010, and I've sort of stayed in this environmental accounting, natural capital accounting world since that time. So very much coming into the environmental question from a national accounts point of view, national accounts economics, that's my entry point into it. And depending on the entry point you come into it, the way we frame the conversation sort of does vary a little bit. So, but I'll pick up on more of that as we go along. Some of you I know, and this voice will sound a little bit unusual because I did lose my voice a couple of days ago. I picked up a little bug while I was traveling, and but my voice has come back enough to be able to talk. I was a little bit worried about that this time yesterday. But I would like very much everyone to get engaged and have a chat about things. And given that, well, if you're here as well for tomorrow with Peter van der Ven to talk about the SNA and other things like that, then it strikes me that you might get to know each other first. So with that in mind, I had a couple of questions that I was just going to go around the room and just ask and just find out a little bit about yourselves. Sort of linking to my other, just these sort of opening things. Maybe you can just give a little bit of sense of what degree you might have done and where you're coming from. That's helpful for me as the presenter to understand that dynamic. I don't know whether you want to. I'll leave this question. I'm going to start with Yorick because I know him, so I don't mind him being an early victim. So everyone else has a little bit more time to think. but if you wanted to give just who you are, where you're working, what background, sort of discipline you're coming from, and then maybe some thoughts about this. I'm also really keen on these last two here. Is there something specific you're thinking that you want to know? Do you have a burning question or opinion you'd like to sort of get out there on the table that you'd like to discuss? Because this environmental accounting stuff can really drive some pretty strong views. So, yeah, Jorrit, over to you.
Thanks. So my name is Jorrit Zwijnenburg. I work at the OECD as head of sectoral accounts. I was heavily involved in the SNA update in the area of wellbeing and sustainability, so already quite familiar with several of the environmental related topics. So why did I come to this training? I'm co-organizer, so I'm part of the IARIW Council and I'm co-organizer of the training sessions. So I wanted to be part of it to see how things are going and also to learn a bit. I have been around the national accounts for, I think, 15 years, and I'm still learning, and particularly in the area of environmental statistics, I'm definitely not an expert. So for me, I'm getting more familiar with the SEIA central framework, but what I would like to learn more about is the ecosystem accounting. That is relatively new to me, and I would like to see the interaction between economy and ecosystems. Do I have a favorite nature place or story? We bought a country house a couple of years ago in the eastern part of the Netherlands, which is very beautiful foresty area. I love going there, doing hiking. And I don't want to upset you, Carl. I've also been to New Zealand, so the neighbor of Australia.
You needed to find some hills.
Yeah, definitely hills, glaciers, mountains, and I would love to return there. It's beautiful nature. So yeah, that would be my favorite.
Fantastic. Thank you, Yard. Wonderful.
My name's Sanjeev Mahajan. Some of you may know me, some of you may not. I'm from the Office for National Statistics in the UK. I'm also the president of the International Impact Association. I am also linked to the SNA as one of the 5 supporting editors under Peter Manavan and Peter Harper, and obviously Carl's another one of the 5.
Keep going.
I've been in economic statistics from the business register, business surveys, household surveys, national accounts, balance payments, blah, blah, blah. For a few years, chesty cough, I won't express what the number few is. I'm still 21-ish. I've been using the ish for more than 21 years. That might be a clue. I'm an Arsenal fan. What favourite home game? Favourite story? Whatever. I met Pele once. And the second time I met Pele, he remembered me from the first time. So
I
it's
can
an interesting
get
one.
you
Obviously, economic statistics with my expertise. I was the editor of the Supply News Tables and Interpret Tables Handbook for the and we have a chapter in there on the environmental accounts. And that was my sort of like getting over the fence into the environmental field. So I'm here definitely on central government, but more so the ecosystems to learn today. And why SEA is different from the SNA, which might come up a few times during the course of the week.
Fantastic.
Hi everyone, I'm François Lafont. I'm Deputy Director of the Complexity Economics Program at the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford. I do economics, broadly speaking, using complexity methods with a focus on environmental and climate change economics and production networks. And so because we're developing sort of new kinds of models, gender-based models in particular, which we think, so macro models, but which we think might have a lot of flexibility. What I want to make sure is that I'm on top of things with respect to environmental accounting so that we can incorporate other dimensions that are usually difficult to put in typical macro modeling. So make use of that flexibility we have.
Perfect. And do you have a favorite place? Somewhere in France?
I would say that in Oxford, I live close to a meadow that is a flood basin of the Thames. And so during COVID, it was very, very appreciated to have a close by area of nature in the city.
Thank you. I'll let you take your time. Shirley.
Hi, I'm Shalini Nandi. I am Assistant Advisor in the Reserve Bank of India. And I have come to this training because I am right now looking into the balance of payments division. So this might change from BPM 6 to BPM 7. And also I was working with the CR Central Framework and the guidance from the big six of the BPM 7, which is about the sustainable finance and cross-border payments, direct investment, ultimate application of direct investment. So the SNA 25 is saying that this guidance note B6 will be the key thing to, so I'm measure the sustainable finance. So like I still couldn't find the full, like exactly how to arrive at sustainable finance. So that's what, like, do you have any burning questions? So that would be one of it for me. And yes, my most favorite place in Oxfordshire during my PhD days was Whittingham Clumps. I used to go there often, climb to the top and just sit and relax. I love to go there again.
Hi, I'm Catherine Van Rompuy. My area of expertise is also national accounts. I've probably been working, I'm going to actually reveal the number of years, more than 30.
Great lady.
And know a lot of people in this room. And I became involved in working on the SNA update. I worked very closely with Yorick and Sanjeev and others in the process. When I worked at Statistics Canada, I spent most of my career there. I recently moved to the World Bank, where I'm in charge of national accounts measures for the World Bank. why did I come to this training? I'm also president of the IARIW, and I have a strong interest in promoting learning opportunities for participants in the conference. It's very nice opportunity for me to be here to see all these new delegates to the association. Is there something specific I want to find out? I'm relatively new to the area of environmental economic accounting. I have had some exposure like yours to work on well-being and sustainability, but I feel a bit like a novice, so I'm hoping to learn a little bit more in detail about how the SNA connects with BIA and what the opportunities are. And I've recently started working at the World Bank in a consulting role for a program called the Changing Wealth of Nations that integrates capital measures from Lucia and the national accounts. And we've had a number of challenges in that. So I'm hoping to gain a greater understanding. In terms of my favorite nature place, I actually grew up on the east coast of Canada on the Atlantic Ocean. If I had to pick one place, I'd say that kind of feels like home for me. When I get close to the Atlantic, now I live in Washington, D.C. And even when I go to Chesapeake Bay, there's a certain smell, there's a certain light. So it really feels like home.
And a Green Gables type of territory.
That's it, yeah.
So I'm Dominic. I work at Statistics Netherlands. I've been working there for 2 years now in the Department of National Accounting as an economic researcher. But my background is in economics and political science, in particular political economic theory.
Okay.
So why I came to this training, I've had some exposure to economic accounting, mostly in like the new SEA integrated framework, or at least like our attempt to implement that. And insofar it relates to the classifications. But I hope to learn more about the broader system and also how it ties into the policy discussions that are ongoing. And for tomorrow's session, I kind of hope that I get some insights into the new national accounts update. Well, in regards to favorite nature place Australia, the Netherlands is actually like a large, big delta. I also grew up in the east. So one part of that area is the Veluwe, but another part of the area, like the large river systems, which got this very particular kind of nature, which is like dear to my heart because I've lived in Arnhem, Nijmegen, Rotterdam now. Yeah, it's the rivers, the big rivers with all like the holders and yeah.
The passion of these nature stories. It's awesome. So for those who've just arrived, we're just going around the room answering these questions, but we'll come back to you guys after it's over.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Koen and I'm from the South African Reserve Bank, and I'm in the National Accounts Unit. I've been there for many years, but I'm not going to reveal the years. Many. And I love national accounts. And why I came to this training, I just want to have an idea of what's going on in the environmental accounts because of the connection to the national accounts, because a lot of the new updates has to do with kind of environmental areas. So I want to sort of widen my knowledge because I am also part of the benchmarking that we plan to do in 2026, and I must advise. So my role is to come and see what's going on and then tell them what to do and who to ask for assistance. And my favorite place, there's many favorite places of nature in South Africa, but my favorite is Kruger National Park. Just going, it's quiet, nobody's bothering you, and you see all these beautiful animals, many and many of them that I like very much. Thank you.
Perfect.
Oh, maybe I must just add in the sporting area, I'm a Springbok and World Cup winner. Thank you.
As an Australian, we're not talking rugby.
I think it was 2 Saturdays sad for Australia. But thank you.
Thank you for that.
Hello everyone, my name is Gonca Şener and this is my first year at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and I've been living in DC for for 1 year now, and I have taken the IMF course on SNA, and then I realized that there is a lot that I need to learn because this is my first year. So I'm here to learn more, but I know that I have a long way to go, especially after seeing you guys. So I need many more years. And so I'm a macroeconomist and I'm in the national accounts. And by and I think everything that I will see here will be kind of new. So it is, there is nothing specific. And favorite nature place, anywhere that's by the sea is my favorite. So that's what I can say. Thank you.
Fantastic. So now Kara?
Yeah.
Karen. Okay. And sorry, I missed your first name.
Gonja.
Nonja. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, people make fun of it because it sounds like ganja. Yeah. So it is actually changing a, that's
Okay.
the easiest way to remember.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone. I'm from Japan, and please call me Taka. My name is Takeshi Sakamoto, but too long, so Taka.
Thank you for that.
And I'm university researcher, but I corporate of cabinet office, especially national accounts and core area. And I study supply and use table and core accounts of national accounts. But I'd like to understand the background information of 2025 SNA and this year, and some kind of the well-being and some kind of the very important information. So I'd like to study this area. And I would like to understand many kinds of the information. But I don't know this here, so this is very interesting for me. Thank you.
And do you have a favorite nature story place?
Especially the CO2 emission area. That is a very important for Japan because average of the temperature increased more and more in Japan.
Yeah.
Too late.
Okay.
So this is a very terrible situation. So I think it's very interesting for me.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm David. It's my first year here at PEA as well. It's my first time attending this national account conference. Really interested in how national accountants and economists go about putting a number to something that doesn't seem to have any clear value to it. So naturally, the economy, environmental account came into my mind. It's a great opportunity to learn how people go about it. And if in the future something come up, some important topic come up, and if we have to find a way to go about it, maybe we can learn from how environmental accountants did it like this. So that's why I chose this training. My favorite nature place. So before joining BEA, I graduated my PhD at UT Austin. During the time, I was glued to the monitor. So I wanted to go to a place where I could free myself from the computers and monitors. So me and my family all went to Grand Canyon. That was really refreshing. It was really, sometimes there is nothing on the road, but there are some canyons if you drive 5 hours from Las Vegas. So that was pretty refreshing experience for myself. So I'm also curious, what's the value of these national parks? If you have to put a number to it, how much is it? Does it depreciate? Does the value change over time? Those kind of stuff. So maybe here I can learn about that. That'd be very interesting. So yeah.
Thanks, David.
My name is Warren. I'm a retired economist with the UBS Investment Bank. I worked on a number of OECD economies, very much a user rather than a producer contributor to national accounts. So I was fortunate at university that national accounting was still one of the required modules within the economics degree. I came partly to delay inevitable obsolescence, but also I've always been interested in the
I'm not writing that down.
interaction between the economy and the environment. And I suppose that the two
not altogether unrelated questions would be the extent to which the work that's being done on the statistical measurement ties in with high theory. One of my teachers in graduate school was Partha Dasgupta, and very much at that time he was coming at things very much from an economic theory standpoint.
Yeah.
But very intriguing, inspiring teacher.
Yeah.
And the second is to the extent that ecologists that develop statistical measures, how are the quantitative frameworks used by biologists or ecologists in particular relating to what economists do? My background is very much economics. I did, I suppose, the American equivalent of A-level biology, but not much since then. But it does strike me that economics tends to have a rather imperialistic attitude towards other disciplines. And it would be interesting just to know the extent to which other developers of a quantitative framework, which I assume some biologists have done, would relate to economic thinking. I suppose my favorite nature place in a way is I grew up in Portland, Oregon, which is unusually green for an American city. But there's a state park called Tryon Creek State Park, plump in the middle of Portland suburbia. But it's an essentially untouched forest from really before the settlements, and it's remarkable having that old a park setting within, let's say, the urban boundaries of Portland.
That's awesome. Thank you, Warren. And I'm loving the fact that we've got sort of mixtures of experience here. This is awesome. So it's great.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle. I'm the first year student here at King's. So my area of interest is more on economic measurements. I have years of experience in poverty measurement and household surveys, particularly on income and expenditure surveys and labor force surveys. And I'm interested to attend to this training because I'll be working later on the labor market table framework with the group of Sanjeev. So I'm looking forward also for tomorrow's session. And for the sales session, I'm also interested on how the SEA is working and how is it connected or linked to the SNA and to the other satellite accounts.
Okay.
And also in relation to the 2025 SNA, since I'm working with household surveys before, I would like to know how can we improve the household surveys for it to be more relevant to the needs of the 2025 SNA. For the favorite teacher place, well, I came from the Philippines, so on the north part of the Philippines, and as you know, there are lots of islands in the Philippines. And for me, my favorite place is anywhere with hills and the seascape, because I think there's peace every time I go there.
Fantastic, fantastic. Sorry, now I missed your name.
Michelle.
Michelle, fantastic. Thank you. I think I've got most of them. Oh, hang on. John, no. Can you repeat your name, please?
Dominic.
Dominic. Yeah. Dominic. Thank you.
My name should be easy to remember. I'm John.
John. It's good that no one's got the same name so far. So going quite well.
I'm John. My research area is national accounts research. I'm working in the area of measurement. I have 7 years of experience in the field of national accounts. I used to work with Mitch, but I was in the national accounts unit. So I worked with the national accounts for 3 years and satellite accounts for 4 years.
Yeah.
I'm interested. I came to this training because I'm mostly interested in the SNA updates. But I've worked in some environmental satellite accounts, and I'm interested in how the sea as well, particularly tourism. Measuring the impact of tourism as MSP. I've worked in terms of my favorite nature place. I also grew up in the Philippines. I like it. I like our beaches, but I like the beaches in Australia as well. I like
Okay.
I like Phillip Island. So.
The penguins.
Yes, penguins.
Yeah. Cool. So you would know. So I have done some work with the Philippines, but it's a while ago now with Mr. Talento. That was quite. He must have retired by now.
Yes, he did. Yeah. He was my boss.
Okay, fantastic.
Hi, I'm Anirban. I just like Stanley. I also work in Reserve Bank of India. I'm part of the GDP growth projections group inside Reserve Bank. So we provide growth projections to the monetary policy. So basically, we are a user of national accounts. Also, because it's been compiled by a Ministry of Statistics, we closely collaborate with them for like new base revisions or new changes, all sorts of things. And then basically the SNA 2025 revisions are happening now. It's just initiated, so everything is sort of like inside the scope for me, and we are part of the committee, so it's basically going to be very helpful for me to like being part of this training session. So basically, in terms of the favorite place, so basically I did my PhD from University of California, Santa Cruz, and that's basically like 2,000 acres of like just redwood. So that's fantastic. So
Yeah.
that's great.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Okay, that corner.
Okay. Hi everyone. I'm Josh Martin. I'm sorry to be late. I work at the Bank of England now. I was previously at the UK Office for National Statistics. My research has been around sort of productivity and capital measurement mostly. I've dabbled a little bit in environmental accounting, bringing environment into productivity, into capital in the national accounts and that sort of thing. So I'm interested in better understanding how SEA treats capital and how that compares with how SNA treats capital, and some bits around that. And in fact, I've got a paper at this conference on that topic. So very nice. And so I grew up in the countryside in South Gloucestershire, just north of Bristol. So I sort of feel nature is sort of my home. That's where I grew up. So lots of walks in fields and that sort of thing in the countryside.
Cool. Thanks, Josh. Good to see you. Last but not least.
Yeah, my name is Mohammed Buse. I'm from the Gambia. I work for the Gambia Bureau of Statistics in the National Accounts Unit. But I've spent most of my time on study. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Insubria in Italy. Should be defending next month, 17th. Yeah, so my area of interest is employment vulnerability and poverty. So choosing what to attend for this particular training was a bit tough. Do I go for national accounts or poverty? But at the end of the day, I decided to come here because we are about also to do a rebasing and get some new benchmarking, and I think that is important. So going to see or learn some new things from here. With regards to nature or place of interest, in my country we have sandy beaches, and they're very beautiful. I really love it there. And apart from that, I really just love being in my country. So choosing a specific place, I cannot really tell. For me, I would just say my country. Right. So that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mohammed. You come to the right place if you want employment and households and poverty. We'll make connections. So, but there won't be anything about rebasing. So you know, I could talk about that, but none of the slides do. So it's going to wouldn't be very good. Perhaps I should. So thank you very much for that. I'm great. We all know a little bit about each other. And yeah, a bit of all economists really, not that that's a bad thing, but funnily enough, it may make it more challenging to try and see how you're going to reframe things a little bit to make these linkages, as Warren was talking about. I probably should give my little nature story. I've been really fortunate in the last little while, and I mean, Australia's a beautiful place. I love driving in the eastern part of Australia, and you just drive, and it's flat, but it's, you know, if you're there and there's no one around, it's quite special. But we've done some hikes in recently. Well, we did one recently. We did a holiday in Iceland just last month, and that's astonishing as a country. Just it's otherworldly. It really is quite remarkable. But if I was going to pick one that's really stuck with you recently, it was a hike I did in Tasmania last December, and we were down in the southwest part, and it's quite remote. And we so you carry everything in on your back, and we did 6 days, I think. And we climbed to the top of this peak, and not a very big peak because it's Australia, so I think it's 1,300 meters. And you sat down and you looked out, and all you could see was trees, like as far, and you just imagine it was just going forever. And I just thought, wow, that's quite remarkable. So anyway, that's my recent nature story. I'll come back to the similarities of all our nature stories as we go through and get to the ecosystem accounting part. But now I'm going to tell you what we're going to talk about. Okay, so this is the morning session. So we have until 5 o'clock. Hi, welcome. Do we have another chair? Sorry to put you on spot. Can I just get your name?
My name is Abdurrahman Omar.
Abraham.
Yeah.
So I will come. We've just done a tour around and everyone's answered a few questions, but I won't get you to jump in straight away. But we will find out a little bit in a few minutes once you've set with you. So 9 till 5. Hopefully, as I said, my voice will last that long, and we're going to do sort of 9 till 10:30. Have a break. Go for another hour. Sort of 4 1.5 hour session, which gives us. We can decide how we want to go. There seems to be quite a bit of flexibility. Right? So there's lunch is not being put on, so we'll have to find somewhere for lunch. And the bathrooms, toilets, if you need them, are out through the door you came in and back out in that sort of lift area. And if you've got any other questions about what's going on, Sarah is just out the door. So what we're going to, I've sort of split it roughly in this way. If we don't keep quite to this, because I've inserted along the way quite a lot of areas so that we just discuss different things. So I'm not too worried about the, I'll try and, but what I will try and do is make sure that we discuss these types of issues in more depth. And certainly this deeper dive on ecosystem accounting will be perhaps getting a little bit more to Warren's question, but hopefully give you a bit of an insight on how we're thinking about bringing ecological data into the national accounting framework. But I'll start with this sort of motivation and role of natural capital accounting. I'm going to call it natural capital accounting, not because environmental accounting is wrong or that environmental economic accounting is not wrong, but if you go in a sort of broader world of sort of beyond the statistics world, natural capital accounting is really the term that's sort of emerged as being the one which is more commonly used. So it also means I've got some slides that use that language, which is sort of quite handy. I guess one of the things that will speak to quite a number is sort of going over the key components of the CEAR. There's two parts to the CEAR Central Framework and the and ecosystem accounting. They cover a very wide breadth of themes. So this is just going to give you a few touch points as to try and see how they might link together. Any one of those themes could be a 2-3 day training course. So we're not going to be able to get into the depth. So this is a sort of a taster of what's going on. But we will try and go a bit deeper on ecosystem accounting because I think it's just so cool. It's so cool. Particularly if you've done capital accounting in the past for either human capital or produced capital. And then if you've done that sort of thinking about capitals, the ecosystem accounting stuff is really very, very cool. We then start the afternoon by looking at a bit more, this is a bit more S&A related in terms of core S&A, of looking at natural resources and the proposals which are coming out through the revised updated S&A in terms of the treatment of natural resources. So I'm going to focus a little bit, I'll just discuss that a little bit. Excuse me. This one here, this valuation essentials, I think this is this is not an area that gets a lot of discussion in presenting this because it does become quite economic. But as it turns out, we've got the right audience here. So it'll be very interesting to get, I'll try and present you some of the issues and the framing of that. And particularly back to David's question, I think, about how do we value something which seems immeasurable or priceless in MasterCard language. Then we'll talk a little bit about, and this links to a couple of other people who sort of said this sort of integrating ecosystem accounts with economic accounts. I'm hoping that by the time we get to here, you might get a sense, at least if you been in national accounts for a little while about where it might fit. So it's sort of a bit of a short session, but short topic, but I think we can discuss it a bit more. And then I'll finish off with a few applications, particularly on the private sector side, to let you know that the statistical and government world is not alone on natural capital accounting. And if I looked at the volume of resources which are going into natural capital accounting, I would say it's probably about I would go probably 60-40 private sector, public sector. Certainly there's an amazing amount of work. You don't hear about it a lot, but there's a lot. It may even be more than 60%. So, yeah. So, yeah, I think that's really important to know, particularly if you're coming from a government sort of section, which I think most of you are. So, about how, and that's a real opportunity for the statistical system to work through. So I'm going to jump back. Abraham, yeah, would you be able to have a go at these questions here? So if you can just introduce yourself, where you've come from, your area of expertise or discipline that you focus on, whether there's a particular reason you came here and you had any particular burning questions, and then maybe finishing up with this.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Abdurrahman Omar Dahir. I'm the Deputy Director General of Somali National Bureau of Statistics. More related, I also under the technical directors of the macroeconomic statistics, including the national accounts statistics division and other technical departments. So I deal with the Somali. We are been experiencing the data gaps when it comes to compilation of the GDP. Now we compile the GDP by expenditure because of the lack of data for combining the national accounts using the production, other approaches. So my expertise is I'm a statistician, so I deal with the technical directors, and from 2017 we are dealing with the combining the national accounts, especially GDP by expenditure. So the area of expert, as I said, with statistician, I did a master's in social statistics, but mostly I deal with I oversee the statistical production. So we have different products that we produce. When it comes to the statistical bulletin, quarterly statistical bulletin, including the key macroeconomic statistics. So those areas that we deal. So we receive a different statistical training from students. So they train about how we can combine the GDP as well as the CBI. So we all the statistical products that you produce. So I think I have captured the training and also.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And do you have a particular environmental nature story or place that springs to mind that's meaningful for you?
Experience?
Well, a favorite nature place, location, or a story, or.
Yeah, we have different. As we are experiencing the data gaps and dealing with the production of statistics. Our favorite is to fill out the statistical data gaps in our country by conducting several surveys so that we compile the required data.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, lovely to have you here. And okay, we'll keep moving along. So while we're doing this, you will, if you didn't know me already, you will have already picked up that I can natter away and talk. But I'm more than happy to be interrupted. So please, if something jumps out at you as I'm going through this, yell out, raise your hand, and we can go into things in more detail if you can't understand what I'm saying or something pops into your mind. So when the term natural capital is used, we're using it as a broad term to relate to the environment, but it's not quite as simple as that. And what we've, sort of after working on this for the last particularly 10, 15 years, it's important to sort of distinguish between natural capital accounting, which is this sort of measurement, sort of organisation of data step, and what we would call a natural capital approach or a natural capital framing or a natural capital thinking, a way of framing a view of the world. And the natural capital accounting is simply an extension of that in a way to try and organise the data. So one of the aims of the natural capital concept is to connect people with nature. So that's what we're trying to do. It goes along with other capitals. It's sort of seen in that sort of broader context as well. But it's particularly, it's particularly about connecting the environment and people. And one of the reasons we want to highlight that connection is because we know that nature is under threat. Notwithstanding the fact that all of us can come up with nice places we could be, we know, and we keep on hearing the stories about the threats to biodiversity, climate change effects, and all of those things that we either experience or hear about. So the question is, how do we make that connection come together? One of the key things about the natural capital way of thinking about it is it's not just a way of sort of saying that we need to think about environment and people and the economy together, but it also switches you into a mindset where, well, how would we respond? We would invest. So we would invest in our asset base in order to get a response that gets us the nice things we want from nature. Now, in a policy space, this is fascinating because most of the time in a policy space, the environment is seen as a cost. Okay? So the notion of thinking about the environment as an investable, as something you invest in, is one of the key aspects of a natural capital framing. And that's done particularly in order to link to the way in which economic and finance decisions are made. So it's not because that's the only way you can frame our relationship with the environment. It's certainly not. There's lots of ways you can go about framing that link. But a natural capital approach essentially emerges because economic and finance they're controlling a lot of decisions. Whether you're at an individual household level, whether you're at a government level or you're a corporate level, economic and finance types of framings are basically driving a lot of those decisions. So the question is, how can we bring, this is the challenge in a sense from a measurement point of view, or a thinking point of view, how can you bring the environment into a similar type of framing? So natural capital is coming from that way of framing the world. And yeah, what we ideally like, I mean, with many working in government here, we want evidence-based responses. One reason to make a distinction between the natural capital approach and natural capital accounting is that for anyone who's been around long enough, it's pretty clear that that data and evidence is not the only thing that influences policy decisions. And as a result, it's as much about the framing of the information and telling a story as it is about the accuracy of the data that you're putting together and the meaningfulness of it. So having credible, robust data, which is the aim of natural capital accounting, it's the aim of official statistics, is a core part, but more importantly, it's the narrative that sits around that. How do we tell that story together? Now, for those people who've been working in macroeconomic statistics for long enough, that narrative about GDP, investment, inventories, profits, all of those things, all of the policy people know that. But we don't have to convince them that there's a narrative. They're all just looking for the information. In this space, they're not asking for it by and large because they don't have a narrative. They might be interested in environmental data and issues, but they don't have a way of bringing it into a narrative. So that's one of the, for me, that's the sort of abiding sort of notion. We can go back a long way. It's almost 40 years ago. A very famous environmental accountant back in the day, Repetto, had this statement: a country could exhaust its mineral resources, cut down its forests, erode its soil, pollute its aquifers, hunt its wildlife to extinction, but measured income, in terms of measured GDP, would not be affected as these assets disappeared. That's one of, I mean, this is what, a year before the Brundtland Commission report on our common future, leading up to the Rio Summit in 1992. So, you know, that it's, the reality is that from a macroeconomic measurement point of view, as yet, nothing has really changed. People are still using GDP. We're not even deducting the cost of produced capital, let alone environmental costs. So I think this is a bit of a motivation of how can we drive this forward. It's not a new, I guess that's another point. This is not new. So this this sort of notion that we've got 4 different capitals, there are different combinations of the number and the labelling, but we're not going to get into that sort of point. We've got 4 here that we're going to describe here, and they are underpinning wealth and well-being. Okay, and in an ecosystem accounting point of view, we want to then think about the stocks, and we also want to think about the flows. So that's one of the key things of a natural capital framing. It's not just about the stocks. You need to think about the flows that you're getting. What are you getting from those stocks? And but on the other hand, what we find in a lot of conversations in the environmental space is there's a lot about the flows and no one's focusing on the stocks. So in actual fact, the natural capital story is one of trying to bring that together in a sort of classical national accounting framing, that you're trying to look beyond, if you think about the whole system of national accounts, not just the GDP part, sort of bring that together. This is a definition of natural capital. It comes from it's a corporate process called the Natural Capital Protocol, developed by a group called the Capitals Coalition. That's now 8 years old. I think it does pretty well as a general definition. As statisticians and accountants, you can argue and quibble about this stuff for a long time. But the general idea is you have a stock that generates a flow of benefits. So, can people see these slides okay?
Quite difficult from this angle.
Yeah.
To see that one.
I don't know whether
If you turn the lights off.
like these 2 lights off. I don't know. There's something we can do there. Oh, not quite that much. Is that better? Cool. Excellent. Thank you. There's plenty of more recent reports highlighting these types of issues. This really milestone landmark, call it what you want, seminal work of the Dasgupta review. So part was mentioned just before. I think it was you one. Clearly leading in that wealth accounting notion, which is just in that last slide as well, that you've got these multiple capitals that are underpinning your well-being. A fantastic piece of work. From my point of view, what was most significant was not that it was written by Siddhartha Dasgupta, because he's written this stuff before, was the fact that it was commissioned by the Treasury. If this had been commissioned by the Environment Department, it would have, it wouldn't have the significance in my view. And it's the reason, if we'd run a training course like this 20 years ago, I think it would have been very hard to get the type of people we have in the room here today. Okay, it's just, there is a change afoot in the economics profession. And the question is, how do we keep on pushing that along? You see it in central banking, this group, that NGFS is the, someone help me, greening the financial system. Network, thank you. Network for greening the financial system. Central banks getting together, talking about how this can work. Apparently there's an updated one called, that my colleague just told me about last week, called the Green Scorpion, which apparently is very good. It's just their reports comes out every couple of years and they just build on each other. This is quite an interesting one. I mean, you'll notice here I've picked up a couple of corporate related ones. This is from the World Economic Forum. And if you look back over the last 5 or 10 years, the top 5 risks, they do their risk report every year ahead of Davos, and in the top 5, they will have had environment-related risks as being at least 3 or 4 of the top 5 things over the course. It dropped out a little bit for a year in 2022 with the war in Ukraine, and nuclear stuff came sort of into the top 5. But yeah, it's quite remarkable. But there's also some there's a World Bank report. I thought I'd better throw that one in, Catherine. The economic case for nature. If you think of climate change, there's a landmark report done, I think about 2010, the cost of inaction. Massive piece of work trying to then say that if we do nothing, then it's going to be really costly. And that's essentially the story we're still trying to mount. So it may be that the comms is bad. So that's one thing to keep in mind here, is how to get the messaging through. Political science is critical here. And there is a group called the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, which has been doing work over the last 10 years now, I think, since it was formed. It's sort of the biodiversity equivalent of the IPCC, which does climate change. And they do reports every now and then to tell us, summarising what's happening in all parts of the world. So there's a lot of stuff going on. It's not hard to find papers that in this space, almost all of them start the same way. Things are looking bad, and then there's a sort of, you just choose your sort of sources that you want to have, and it's sort of an endless possibilities. So I wanted to the thinking that the way that I come with this, and that I've got a small small consulting company now, IARIW. You might see that every now and then at the bottom. We formed in 2015 to take forward work on natural capital accounting, essentially. So my stats life is sort of still there because I'm still doing statistical stuff. But when I say we, I'm sort of talking about us as our view of the world. We want to try and take a nested systems approach. And what do I mean by nested systems? I mean, we have sort of business and economics in the middle. It sits on a sort of a set of social rules that's there, which has a lot of players in it. But both the economy and society live within an environmental context. So there's a dependency that comes from how you think about that. And what we want to try and do through a natural capital accounting is provide a set of information that fits this type of a narrative, to support that type of a narrative. It's instructive, I think. Again, this is not new. This sort of integrated nested systems thinking has been around for ages. The trick is, how do you translate that into something which is measurable and you can tell a story about it. So you'll see a very similar diagram that's sitting in the C Essential framework. This is sort of just an elaborated version of it. So that was done in 2011, 2012. Back then, when we were doing that, we weren't doing ecosystem accounting. We were just looking at the way in which we're thinking about accounting for water and energy and those types of things. We had a discussion. Should we present this sort of economy environment as sort of two distinct pillars? Or should we present them as sort of integrated and sort of nested? And there was general agreement we should do them as nested. And actually, the diagram looks a bit like a fried egg. And partly because it was, I think, my PowerPoint skills, which did at the start. But the point being was, when you go through the ecosystem accounting, when you go through the C Essential framework and you look at individual themes and you account for one natural resource, water or energy or air emissions, you don't need a nested systems framing in order to organise and interpret the data. You can quite happily do it as two separate systems. And that's actually a traditional way of thinking about sustainable development. We have environment, economic, society. We have 3 pillars or silos, and everyone goes off and measures things. Or you have the 17 SDGs, and you've got 17 columns that everyone's going off to work on their part. And the challenge is, how do we think about those things working together? And the opening of the SDGs says really nice stuff. But in practice, it's very hard because we have an institutional framing. All of us are economists, right? And in other rooms around the world at the moment, we've got social scientists, we've got environmental specialists, we've got a whole range of different disciplines. We learn it from school, we get kicked off. We've got policy departments that are separate. So I'm sort of saying there's a motivation. Don't underestimate the challenge we face in trying to move in this direction. It's not purely about organising data. I'd like to think that organising data can help, but there is a much deeper story going on. Back to the investing in nature part. Again, I've stolen this from a project that was done a little while ago called We Value Nature, thinking of nature-based solutions. But this idea that you've got the stocks generate some flows of ecosystem services, get you value and benefits to people and business. You get some solutions, and then you're investing back into the stocks. And I think it's really so that return on investment mindset. If you keep that going, and try and find as many analogies as you can. So I've spent most of my time doing this over the last 10, 15 years, looking for analogies in the national accounts or in economics. So what would I do if it was a house or a truck or something else? How would I think about it? And can I reframe the environment in that context? Because often what happens in the environmental context is you focus on this bit. The economists go, if you're doing sort of standard environmental economics, what you'll do is you'll go straight to here. generally. What are the losses in value for health effects of air pollution? What's the social cost of carbon? Those types of questions. And the policy response then becomes, well, we need to stop the bad stuff happening. So we need to stop the emissions. The idea of actually investing in the stocks starts to get lost. It's not that stopping emissions, I mean, that's a great idea. I mean, nothing against mitigation. But we just, that you can still do that and reframe it in a context of understanding the capital. And then this is the last slide in this little section, and then I'll see if I can get a discussion going. I want to try and we've been trying for quite a long time because we're big fans of the model capitals or integrated capitals type of thinking. But how do you get it to work, and how do you lock it in? So because what tends to happen is that specialists in natural capital don't talk to the people who are good at human capital. Social capital still, it's been around for a long time, it's still its own thing. And then the produced capital is just the national accountants, and no one talks to them, and they don't talk to people. So, sorry, as a national accountant, sometimes I have a go at our own profession quite a lot. But what that means is that you tend to think that if you want to get natural capital outcomes, you should invest in natural capital. If you want to get human capital outcomes, you invest in human capital, education. If you want to get produced capital outcomes, you build something or make something. But in actual fact, to get the benefits that you want from those different capitals, it may be smarter to invest in something else. So you may get really good natural capital outcomes from investing in human capital, better farming techniques and knowledge, or social capital, and get a network of farmers together to talk about how they might do things. And you're still achieving these natural capital outcomes, that you're getting the benefits that you want to get. So, which speaks to another point of the return on investment story, is that the stocks and the flows are different. Just because you've got a change in the stock, it doesn't necessarily mean you've got a change in the benefit. And so you want to be achieving natural capital benefits. That's what you want to get out. In actual fact, if you see benefits as a sort of a large thing which are underpinned by a combination of capitals, then you'll start to see, well, in any given context, I could invest here or there. And then your policy solutions become much more sort of open because, yeah, it's some sort of combination that you're trying to get across. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because then the next bit gets into a little bit more of the data organisation side. Thoughts or reflections? As you see, I love this stuff. So, Sanjeev.
A couple of thoughts. Firstly, terminology, the use of the word capital and the use of the word resource. I see it used quite often interchangeably. Now, the way you put it up there was the capital was the stock, and in a sense, the resource was the flow. I get that. But what is your view on the use of being forced in to make sure that all are being treated as capitals? Is one thought process. And the other one is, when you talk about stocks flows and the benefits, it's easy to measure flows, relatively speaking, harder to measure stocks, and really difficult on benefits. If you can't sell the value of the benefit, what's that domain about? I thought I'd start with easy questions. Yeah.
So on if I had suggested that the resources were a flow, then that was probably not what I was meaning to say.
It was in the definition. It's interpreted in that definition that you had on the right hand side.
I think though that is the stock of natural resources that leads to a flow of benefits.
Flow of benefits. Right.
Flow of benefits is the sort of bottom part of the sort of thing. So so resource of this stock. I think the important thing for me in using the word capital is that it often gets ascribed to just being the stock, but that's why I'd sort of start thinking this sort of natural capital thinking idea is really about the link between the stocks and the benefits. And the more that you consider that capital word is being used in that context, it's certainly it was a big discussion back in the CS Central framework where we used the term environmental assets, which is actually it's a statistical version of this definition. But there was a big push against using the term natural capital from people. So environmental assets it was because people have this sort of, some people have a very big thing against the use of the word capital as meaning it must imply monetary valuation. And it is sort of a proxy for a capitalist takeover of everything. and that hasn't worked. I've actually heard the same story about human capital. There's parts of the ILO that strongly argue against the use of the term human capital because it commodifies people. That's the concern. So I would prefer in that sort of thing to think of capital, trying to get across these sort of broader ideas that capital is a term we use partly because we're trying to speak to a group of decision makers who that's their framing. Now, if the world was run by scientists, we could do something completely different, but it's not. And so it's partly so I can see, so there was the second part.
Just on that,
Yeah, please.
I just want to throw in an additional point, like the word wealth. Okay, so because we're talking about terminology, so when we think about telling a story and all of that, and we talk about we kind of in national accounts we equivalize those terms, right? The summation of capital is equal to national wealth. You know, if you account for your liabilities to the rest of the world, but that word seems to me to be more intuitive. You know, when you think about natural assets as being part of wealth, national wealth, right? Or the larger concept of wealth.
True, but I'm pretty sure that everyone can come up against an argument against every term.
That's sure.
Yeah.
So when we think about the capital, then what is the corresponding depreciation of the natural capital? So how does natural capital depreciate, or does it depreciate?
Yes, it does. It can do so in two ways. One is that the actual physical quantity disappears.
Is it by humans or?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the second way is that the quality of the environment can change. So the first one, where you're sort of physically removing stuff, we sort of generally put under the heading of depletion, and we'll get to that this afternoon. So that's sort of more looking at our natural resources, so as defined in the SNA, of sort of mineral and energy resources, timber resources, fish resources. So you're just pulling stuff out. Degradation is the term we use for looking at this sort of broader concept of change in environmental quality.
So along with that, I think you had a slide that was saying that the investment in natural resources. That one. So then rather than going back to doing the trying to make what I'm trying to say is, do we really differentiate between investing in the depreciation, investing to prevent depreciation, versus investing into the naturals? Do we differentiate that? You gave an example of emissions, reducing the emissions. That's kind of one way to invest, but I think this is kind of like preventing depreciation kind of thing, right?
One of the great things about this whole space is that it gets complicated really quite quickly, and then you can get multiple benefits from one level of action. Right? So, but it's still if you think of produced capital and the idea that you I'll go with a truck because it's in Josh's paper and it's the stuff. So it's nice and there's a truck, you pay money for it, it depreciates over time, consumption of fixed capital. And if you reinvest and buy another truck, you've sort of invested it, but you're always going back to invest in that stock, and that depreciation will happen over time. And so you're investing to recover back, because what you want to do is try and get an ongoing flow of capital services. And you can apply the same thinking in a environmental context. Essentially, you've got this loss of value that's happening over time due to a decline in quantity or a decline in quality, and that you're trying to then pick up, okay, we need to invest to recover some of that base. But some of that base can build itself. In nature, it's unusual because it can build itself. Yeah. It has that potential. And that's a really interesting point for discussion. But you are trying to deal with that depreciation degradation point of view, which gets into then a notion around sustainability as well. Dominic.
Because you're essentially talking about a paradigm shift in the way that we think about the environment, and very inherent in that idea is that environment isn't good in and of itself. I guess one of the big benefits that we have, at least with national accounting, is that economists have convinced policymakers that, look, we all agree GDP is a thing, and nobody says it's not many people at least say it's bullshit, but
There's a lot. There's just not.
But not as much. But I get like because of course like the idea that environment is a good in and of itself is a tad more contentious. I'd say. I mean, like in Europe, we have like the European Green Deal, which is a big thing, and receives a lot of pushback from especially the populist right. So I was kind of thinking like I can do two ways. Like first, like, what's your experience in communicating that idea? And also more about thinking as a profession as a whole. Of course, like in the social sciences, you're used to being politicized. The economists are not, and that's a benefit. You know, I think like the most effective profession when it comes to policy advice. But don't you think you kind of make that bit harder when you go through this paradigm shift? It's the contentious nature of it.
If I thought there was an easy answer to that question, I'd like to think that we would have found it by now. I think the point is that, for me at least, is that the way things are working at the moment is not working for us, you know, in a long-term sort of sense. So, but there's a lot of people with excellent expertise in particular disciplines, in economics, in ecology, in all sorts of areas. And the paradigm shift is essentially to say, how can each of those disciplines look out of where they are and connect with people in other disciplines to find sort of more meaningful ways forward? So you could say, but you could treat it the other way. Say, right, economists, you can just stay where you are, or accountants, you can just keep what you're doing, just broaden it out a little bit. Don't worry about talking to anyone else, just broaden it out a little bit. But even that is then going to become quite a big challenge for people to broaden their thinking. So whether you call that just someone broadening out a little bit, taking a slightly bigger picture, whether you see that as a paradigm shift or not, you could make the same case without going paradigm shift, I guess. My sense, though, is that when we get into the ecosystem accounting stuff in more detail, when it clicks, it makes a massive difference. So, and it's not just an information story. It is people reframing connections. And how long it takes, some people get it really, really quickly, like 10 minutes. One guy understood, admittedly, the analogy he used in his mind to understand it was really weird, but nonetheless, he got this sort of connection of broadening what was happening. Other people I've seen take a couple of years to make this sort of shift about how do they bring the environment into what they're doing now. That's really the question. So whether you want to call it a paradigm shift or not is another question, but I don't think we can. I think people need to start thinking a bit wider and bigger about what's going on. I don't think we can get away from that. If there was a way of making that easy, yeah. Because at some point you run into what does happen a lot is that we do, you know, natural capital accounts for companies and for countries. You get a set of information together and people look at it and I don't know what to do with it. Because they've got no framing about what I do with it. When you give them a set of national accounts, they say, oh, yeah, no, I'll put more produced assets because I can see that's going to go up and this is going to go here. But actually trying to work out that for the environment, people just, you know, they think they need some sort of really high-end training in it. I'm hoping I can get you guys a little across the line in a day, but yeah, you might already be there, to be fair. Last one, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, so basically, like, my question is related to this, but regarding, like, if we add the quality dimension to this, so the quality of the physical capital is very different from, like, the natural capital quality, and how does that basically, like, link to the value? So, like, how does quality fit into this entire?
How does quality fit in?
Yeah.
So if you have a high quality stock, then the chances are for a given quantity, you have a high quality stock, you should get a more effective and or even larger set of flows, maybe a wider set of flows, which will then sort of the values then come from an environmental point of view of getting more flows and perhaps it becomes a little bit cheaper in a way. So there could be a cost saving as a result of having improved quality of natural capital.
How do you identify it? Like, how do you distinguish between a quality, like high quality versus a low quality?
I'm going to hold that question.
Well, from a national accounts perspective, it's valuation.
Yeah, it's a valuation question, except for the fact that quality is a volume change. So let's hold that one. Let's come back to that. That's a, yeah. I haven't been asked that quite that way before. So I have to think about that. All right. Okay, so where does natural capital fit in? Why do we want to bother about doing this at all? And this is particularly from the perspective of ecosystem accounting. But what we know is that if you go and look at environmental policy and environmental responses, we've got a whole lot of what we would call applications. So there's people going about developing environmental markets. There's people looking at restoration and management activities for the environment. There's people doing risk assessments, looking at what's the prognosis going out. They might want to do some sustainability performance reporting. Lots of frameworks for that. You know, state of environment reports, global biodiversity framework. Corporately, there's the GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative. Sustainable farming. So this, I think we might have done this for a little bit. Agriculture. So you know, there's a lot of sectors that are looking at more sustainable ways of doing things. We might do some scenario analysis, climate change or loss of biodiversity. So there's a whole lot of questions and ways in which we can frame why we want to know about things. And what will tend to happen is each of these will go off and develop their own data set. And as a result, we get a whole lot of methods, tools, data, platforms. Maybe you need some other information and assumptions. You might need some environmental thresholds or design a scenario going forward. But they've all got their own data sets, and the world is replete with environmental data and environmental data sets. And this is you know, a massive consultancy opportunity because in actual fact, for each one, then you get to go across here, and it's a massive opportunity for the data sets. What we take for granted is that it happens to some extent, but it doesn't really happen, at least in macroeconomic statistics. So if you want to do a risk analysis of the world climate change scenario, you want to do some sort of evaluation of management practice or supply chain analysis, or you wanted to run a market within the economy or assess a market, you wanted to report on your performance, generally you would start from the national accounts and input-output table, supply use table, a balance of payments sort of set of data. And everyone who was doing that type of approach would use the same data set. You know, it's quite, the transaction cost reduction there is quite remarkable. And I think we completely, if you're sitting in the economic analysis space, completely take for granted what's happened in national accounts and economic statistics generally as providing a database. And it's not perfect. Everyone knows that. But the fact that everyone goes to the same place means that the decision maker doesn't have to worry about, you know, well, someone in my department has gone off and done a consultancy on looking at restoration activity effectiveness, and someone else has done a risk assessment, someone else has done performance reporting, and they've all used different data to feed into it, and the decision maker doesn't know, oh, what's going on? So, and I'm happy to know that, happy to accept that this is idealistic, but what we want to try and get to is we've got all of these different applications. We've got another one, which I'm going to call natural capital accounts as an output. And I've used the word accounts here very deliberately because what we want here is to have all the same data that we've got on the other side, bring it through a framework, different methods, accounting processes, so that we get an integrated and coherent accounting data in the middle, and then add in a few additional assumptions if you need to on scenarios, thresholds, etc. And then you're able to undertake all of those activities. Now, for official statisticians in the room, you say, oh, yeah, of course, that makes sense. But that's essentially the SEER is aiming at this framework idea. It doesn't give you a set of methods of exactly how you should do it. It doesn't give you the data. But it tries to say this is a common language. This is a common framing. If you've got this piece of data, put it over here. Now, the way in which we design the framework needs to be cognizant of what questions you're trying to answer. You can't just design a framework in the abstract. So you've got to be trying to do that. Although over time, what happens, and this is the national accounts, is that it's a framework which is now used for all sorts of things. If you're starting from scratch now, maybe you design it differently. But, you know, it was developed there. You can pull out whatever data you want as an analyst and bring it together. So that's, for me, is a mindset that we need to move sort of towards, and that's where there's a wonderful opportunity for official statistics and indeed the broader measurement research community to actually work collectively towards a goal. At the moment, basically, most of the money is going to these individual applications because, yeah, so these guys are driving the ship at the moment. Sanjeev.
So what I'm about to say, you might think, my God, is he having a laugh on a Saturday morning? National accounts and national accounting statistics are not gospel.
No.
And when we try, and we had a lot of discussion and disagreement before we agreed to put in the physical supply news tables and the physical impact tables into the core part of the supply news table handbook, because the monetary and the physical should and can be compiled together.
Yep.
But my point is, there's a feedback loop.
Yep.
And I don't see enough of that, because there's an element of the national accounting statistics are viewed as gospel. So when you look at barrels of oil or bales of hay, et cetera, and you have the valuation you get through beyond the physical tables into the ecosystems accounts, I don't see the feedback loop.
No.
It's almost saying that whatever you've come up with in your current price and in volume terms, supply news tables and impact tables, that's it. That's your constraint. But surely some of it doesn't make sense as you go further down that chain.
Absolutely. So the issue of integrated and coherent, at least in my mind, and the way the SIA was motivated and designed, was that this framework of the SIA should be essentially completely interoperable with the SNA. So that you should be able to do that monetary physical for the same products for the same time period and link it together. But that requires, that's not I don't think it's so much a conceptual issue, because the SIA has been designed that way. It's a process issue within statistical office or whoever's compiling national accounts in the SIA. That it's a very real challenge. But I would have thought in most cases, national accounts would be improved by the inclusion of physical data to try and work out what's going on, and whether or not the price information and the implied prices then become reasonable. So it's particularly relevant if you're in the environmental modelling or integrated environmental modelling type of space, because, yeah, otherwise you can get some really weird stuff happening, I would presume. Sorry, yeah.
So here you're talking about like the integrated coherent accounting data, but then the question comes like, that the data definitions are like same across all of this. Like, is there any framework which is being like developed to like synchronize the data definitions across different applications for the national account?
Yes. So the SIA has got a set of definitions, and where it's relevant, that would be the same as the SNA in terms of product classification, industry classification, etc. What happens on the data supply side is a separate question. But in the same way as most economic surveys don't completely meet the definitions required for national accounts, the national accounts are adjusting data and those sorts of things, you have the same challenge in the environmental data space. So, but there's much more variability on the data from an environmental point of view in terms of what's actually collected. So the challenge is actually sort of bringing it into this sort of space. Whereas, you know, the majority of economic statistics are coming from company accounts or similar, and so and the sort of corporate accounting framework and the national accounting framework are, you know, pretty well aligned. I mean, you quibble about the details, but they're basically pretty well close to trying to do the same thing. So this is the so that was then just unpacking this sort of integration accounting type of step, and we've identified there's a lot of confusion in the environmental space because there's so many products out there. There's so many different acronyms and other bits, this sort of alphabet soup of different things. So we've tried to make a distinction between what you need as frameworks and standards, methods for going and collecting the data, the tools and the data platforms that you need, which I guess actually includes the data as well. But there's software that you'll need in order to be able to do things. And there's a range of initiatives and applications that are out there which are using that. And all of those somehow have to come together. The SIA is only dealing with this part, so that's what we're focusing on, these standards and frameworks. But just to say, even once you've done that, you've got a whole lot of other bits that need to come together in order to tell the story. And then this sort of goes back to the link to decision making. The notion here is that, this is very much in a public sector space, but you can apply it in other contexts as well, that you've got this notion of a policy cycle. And it sort of doesn't really matter where you start. But let's start here. You identify a problem that needs to be solved. You go through some policy design. You'll then implement the policy. You monitor it, and then you review it, and then you keep going around again. And so that's a fairly generic idea. And quite a while ago, we were trying to think, well, where does accounting fit into this? Where does data fit into this? You know, is it here? Is it here? Is it here? And then we realized, well, in actual fact, it's everywhere. So this coherent information set we're talking about should be able to be used at all of these different stages of the process. It should be able to identify your problems. And that's essentially what national accounts can do. They say, well, that industry has collapsed. This one's growing way too much. Or we've got imbalances somewhere in the system. I mean, that's what an accounting system is designed to do, to tell you where you've got things going on that you didn't expect or didn't want. But then you got to do something about it, and that can help you. That narrative can help you frame. Should I invest? Should I pay a subsidy? All of those sort of choices then come from that design thing, but you're in that same framing of natural capital, or in this case, natural capital. Implement it, monitor it, review it, and you've got that at the heart of the story. So that's, again, another part of the overall story. What I've got here. Let's finish this question and then we can have a.
And I think because I was thinking one of the challenges I think for national accounts and also one of the challenges for the SIA central framework is you have multiple users in different domains, and everyone was used to their own terminology, used to their own classifications. Everyone has their own wishes. And now you have to put everything together in one framework. So everyone will be annoyed to a certain degree because no one gets exactly what they want. And I think this is one of the challenges, to have the conversation with all those users to make sure that they understand the value added of aligning while still accepting the fact that they might not get everything they want. And I think that is what you might have been referring to with your question, how to ensure that. And I think that's
really good point. And it's a point that I'm going to guess a lot of people in this room would agree with violently. It is, in actual fact, one of the big challenges on the environmental measurement space, because what you find is that there's so many different measures of biodiversity. It's remarkable, and none of them are necessarily wrong. But as a result, if you want to communicate what's going on, it's very difficult because you can get differences. Even something like this is going back about 10 years or so ago. I saw a presentation with about deforestation in Indonesia, which is generally acknowledged as a challenge. This guy put up a slide. It had 6 different measures of deforestation in Indonesia, and one in actual fact showed forest area increasing. And so you think, oh, how can you have a meaningful policy discussion about what you should do when you have 6 different numbers and all potentially worked out, perhaps coming from, as an environmental NGO doing it, there's some FAO reports, there's someone doing a satellite, World Resources Institute doing a satellite approach. So what happens is that everyone debates the different methods and techniques, and I can come up with a better method and a quicker one and whatever, and that. But every estimate then, it sort of then creates a level of confusion in the world. Because any country could come up with 15 different estimates of GDP. It wouldn't be hard. Just give one, you get 15 people. Yeah, you get 15 universities and say, each of you do that. And that's why what's fascinating, you look at IPCC and climate change. They call it consensus forecast, right? And it's not because, it's because they basically don't all agree. They've got different models, but they've recognized, in actual fact, if we all just publish our different separate models, no one's listening to us. So let's all get together and come up behind what do we think is what the result is. And that just hasn't happened with nature. I mean, even one of my big shocks, so this is going back to the writing of the precursor to the SIA ecosystem accounting, was the SIA experimental ecosystem accounting, which was written in 2012, 2013. And as I was going, I got to the biodiversity thing, and I thought, all right, what do I know about biodiversity? Not very much. So and I just framed it up. I thought, well, what we'll do is the species account in the SIA is very basic. It says this is how many you had of this species at the beginning. This is how much you had at the end. This is how much went this, this births and deaths, right? It's pretty basic. So I thought, well, I can't list every species. That's going to fit on the page. So I thought I'll just do it, using my sort of year 7 science. I'll do it by animal kingdom. So I thought, plants, animals, and I thought, I better find out from someone how many there are. So I Googled it, came up with a number. I got 7. But you'll notice, I don't know if you look, there's a footnote to that table. It turns out the scientific community hasn't decided how many kingdoms there are. It varies, depending on who you talk to, how you want to treat sort of different, I can't remember the details of it now, but sort of, wow, no wonder you're having trouble communicating this stuff. So everyone then develops their own sort of interpretation of things, and as a result, it basically gives a reason for decision makers not to act because they don't have an agreed, and it's not just the number, it's just even the common language. So
We
if
just don't believe it. We just don't believe it. They don't believe
well, it's easy to not believe because
nobody really knows what the answer is. So
yeah, no, I don't know. Yeah, so I think that's sort of the communications challenge. I think that's part of the role of the seer is actually to force a common language, which has happened in the national accounts.
Just to add to that, in a sense, I'll take the UK experience. Many, many years ago, we used to publish 3 estimates of GDP, one from production, one from income, one from expenditure. And guess what? They were all different. And we published them. And because we were a very sophisticated group of species, we added the 3, divided by 3, and provided a 4th average. So there's 4 numbers. So at the end of the day, what use is that to any Tom, Dick, or Harry? So in the end, eventually, we said, no, we're going to do a balancing process. We're going to put one number out there. And immediately that enhanced the user engagement. So what you're saying, I can relate to in that.
Yeah.
And that's something that's more structured than the environmental space. Then what I want to say is, it's a little plug for the 2025 SNA in terms of a glossary. Now, when someone says glossary, you go, oh, God, that's boring. Hold on. We had 8 standards across which we had over 1,200 terms to reconcile, to come up with an agreed glossary of about 800 terms. Now, in some of the standards on the same term, there was a different definition. So it was a big exercise. And obviously, we had to get people to compromise and agree. And that is something that relates to what you're saying. And your point about definitions, it's very important to have common definitions. And having a glossary is one step, teeny weeny step in the right direction. But then in each domain, you can have a subset of definitions that are pertinent to that domain that you can't unify. And my final point is on databases and methods, you could have the same method applied to different databases producing different results.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that is another problem in the research space because there are people who've got their own databases, produce their own results. And I often say to them, use that same method, but can you use this other database, whether it's GTAP, Euler, et cetera, what does that come up with your results? And you get very different pictures. So then, well, which result do you believe? Because your source data is very different, but your method is exactly the same.
Mm. So
there is a challenge to engage people by giving a coherent picture. A single estimate goes a long way than lots of disparate estimates.
Yeah. So, and we're in that journey where it was on the, particularly when it comes to nature and biodiversity, it's fairly early days, but hopefully there's enough goodwill. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop for a break. Thank you, because it's just sensible practice. And we'll come back and we'll start to talk about the key components of the SEER. So this is a sort of historical chart. The core of the story here is that it's important so we're talking about the SEER now. The SEER has its origins in the national accounts. I think it's really important to understand that. So this is, I didn't want to say who this guy is.
E.T. American?
No. Kuznets. Simon Kuznets. I don't know when the photo was taken, but I've picked him as being one of the founders of the national accounting system. He's not the only one. So we've got the S&A started, but right from the start, there was debates about the quality of the measurement of national accounts and GDP in relation to environmental costs. It's not hard to find that, and well-being generally. I stumbled across, and I've never been able to find it again, an amazing paper from, I think it was like a precursor to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. I mean, maybe in Chamber of Commerce. I mean, I know you're in there, but from 1946, and it was debating about how to treat mineral resources. in the national accounts. And I've never been able to find it again. I don't know where I found it. I can't find it again. Anyway, I just thought, wow. Yeah. So again, none of this stuff is new. That's Robert Kennedy. Anyone want to go for the year? He gave that speech, very famous speech.
Yeah. It was about like, it was saying that like how much the people, the happiness and, so it is, GDP is not a good measure to, to measure the happiness. And it was talking about like how the weapons are included in the GDP, all those things.
Yeah. Imagine 1967, October 67, close. GDP measures everything except the things we value, to paraphrase. So again, not new. So we get to 2008. Well, I just put the latest version in because it was 53, all the versions that went along. I mentioned already the Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future, 1987, leading to the Rio Summit. And that's when the first SEER came out. So the SEER 1993 was the first was an action point out of the Rio Summit. So, but it was coming from national accountants deciding we need to do something about getting a better measure of GDP. If you look at the SEER 1993, very focused on adjusted measures of GDP. They came up with 4 different measures, different ways of doing it, and that's what it was focused on. But it never became a standard. Some countries are doing it. There were lots of other models that came out related to that. Where do I go here? I'll keep going across here. Because then there was a SEER in 2003, which is a white book. It's about that thick. Really, really impressive document. Very difficult to read. It's about 14 chapters or so, each written by different authors. But the coverage is impressive. The one thing it couldn't deal with, or didn't know how to deal with, or couldn't find an agreed solution, was changing the quality of the environment. So that was the really outstanding thing. But it dealt with a whole lot of the other things which are now codified in the SEER Central Framework. Essentially, the SEER Central Framework process started in 2007-8, and fairly early on, relatively early on, well, within a couple of years, they realised that we couldn't, it wasn't going to be possible to cover off on every research topic that wanted to be solved within the scope of the SEER set of problems, and in particular the question of environmental degradation, and change it so that quality changed. So they said, right, we'll split it into 2 parts. And for a long time, it was known as Volume 1 and Volume 2. And Volume 1 became the SEER Central Framework. And these were basically codifying everything that everyone had basically agreed to, which I'll run through in a minute. But the environmental degradation part became Volume 2. And the idea was that this should become a statistical standard. The central framework. If we have all agreed, basically we just got to lock it in, write it down, get it out the door, and then we'll worry about the stuff we haven't been able to answer in a separate volume. They came out in 2012. It was a significant development, mainly because, and I hadn't sort of fully appreciated it wasn't technically, it almost added nothing technically to the SEER 2003. I'd like to think it was slightly better written, but that's not for me to judge. The big thing is that it was adopted as a statistical standard by the UN. And what that then did was gave it a profile that sort of pushed things along. And I think that's, it gave, but particularly in non-developed, non-statistically developed countries, it gave a stronger rationale for getting funding, all sorts of things, sort of positive things that came out of it. So the Sustainable Development Goals of 2015, it sort of then you're starting to make linkages between this statistical standard. Where can we use it? Which is still an ongoing process of trying to get into this sort of why, because there's not many people in the sustainability space who see the value of an integrated data set. Basically, why would I spend all this money on an integrated data set when all I just need these 3 indicators? So I'll just measure those. And yeah, that value is, so that's still an ongoing challenge. And then we had the ecosystem accounting. So there was an experimental ecosystem accounting 2013. This one came out in 2021. And yeah, it's pretty cool. The experience of putting it together. What's essentially what happened in moving from the central framework to ecosystem accounting is we went from a almost purely statistical document to one that engaged a very, very wide range of people, because the knowledge of how to do ecosystem accounting, all of the little bits and pieces, was not sitting in any statistical office. So that, I mean, for me, it was just joy. I just love picking together and joining together. So that's sort of the story there. But the other thing that was happening at the same time is obviously, I think it's always important to remember, apart from the sort of technical and intellectual advances in accounting, the reason this is important is because there's a whole lot of really bad stuff happening to the environment and to people. And we're trying to play a small part in maybe playing a response to that. And you can't forget that in actual fact, getting a nice set of numbers is one thing, but there is a motivation. And there's a very landmark report here called Ecosystems and Human Wellbeing, the Millennium Ecosystem Report in 2005. There was 2010 was a big year, a document called The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, TEEB, came out in 2010. The UK, who's been a leader in this space for a long, long time, released a national ecosystem assessment in 2010. They also formed a natural capital committee. And so, yeah, there were some resources put into this space around natural capital that came through. The Dutch were leaders early on, as is quite common in statistical. So, yeah, and so these other things, the Waves World Bank, which is no longer Waves, it's, I don't know what it is now. Thank you. Corporate sector was doing work, as I've said before. So it's just been an ongoing thing of trying to find connections and bring together pieces of information. So it was a much longer than I wanted because I'm moving through this. Right.
Oh, can I just mention one thing?
Yes, please.
I think I'll be reasonably comfortable with this statement, whereby I think the SEER and the SNA, the gravitas is such that they're on par and they're viewed on par, and that's growing. It's important to note that. I'm not saying that from a national accounts or an environmental view. I said look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, that's pretty. Yeah, I find that sort of statement a little bit. Because certainly when it was released, there was no way it was on par. It happened very quickly as well. The process went through was essentially, the drafting was done over a year, yeah, it all went through. But it just, the fact that it got through spoke to the demand. And I think that's which is why it's really important in the SNA revision that it's actually explicitly recognising the developments, not just in natural capital, but in human capital, that's been going on for many years, about bringing this, that there is a body of work that we need to, the people are wanting to see how we can do it. So the SEER itself is split into two parts. As I said, part of it is a codification story about, we basically knew how to do all of the things that are in this central framework when it was written in 2010, 2012. Ecosystem accounting was basically completely new, at least from a statistical point of view. So the key distinction that I would say is the reason that it's two sides of the same coin is that essentially it's a one planet story. We've got one planet, but we're looking at things through two different lenses when we're considering the two different SEERs. In the SEER central framework, it's picking individual parts of the environment or separate parts. I mean, you could use it in different terms, but it's looking at timber, water, fish, soil, minerals, individual components, and measuring those is a really sensible thing to do. In and of itself, it's fundamental. The ecosystem accounting is taking a different view and saying, well, how does some, in a particular context, how do all those little pieces fit together? And we've used ecosystems as a sort of the lens by which we're bringing them together. But yeah, this notion that we're trying to think of the connections between things is much stronger in here than it is over here. So in actual fact, you can do everything that's in the central framework with having this sort of two pillars approach of environment and economic. You don't need a nested systems view of the world in order to do ecosystem, to do the central framework accounts, because you're just picking on one thing and you're just accounting for it.
Ask you, I mean,
Just to make it a bit more concrete, what would be the example of the distinction between timber on the left and forest on the right, or water on the left and rivers on the right?
What's the difference? When we're doing the accounting for timber or accounting for water, we're purely looking at the volume of timber in a tree, and how many it might be in the forest. You're just looking at the timber, and if you're looking at water, it's looking at how much essentially the stock of water in a lake, in a river. It's not saying anything, and it's basically looking purely quantitatively. So a lot of water accounting would just say this is how much was there, this is how much we took out, this is how much went back in. A water balance is a hydrologist would call it a water balance. It's the same sort of notion. You could do the same here with, and this is actually a topic that's under discussion at the moment. You could do carbon accounting would fit in here. So you're just looking at the stock of carbon. Now, at the beginning, stock carbon at the end, this is how much went to the atmosphere, this is how many, so you're just following individual elements, substances, stocks. Whereas over here, you're saying, okay, well, this is a forest. What have I got? Well, I've got this much timber, so that would be the same. But I've also got these birds, and I've got a river going through the middle of it, and I've got people wandering through for doing a hike. And so you're trying to tell a narrative about a particular area. Does that help?
And so, I mean, there used to be quite a bit of concern about deterioration of the quality of the forest in southwest Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would show up as a quality measure on the right, whereas the volume of the wood might be largely unchanged.
Might be exactly the same. Yeah. What you will get mixes between them though. So, for example, if the quality of the wood was somehow related to, or maybe the growth profile had changed because of climate change or poor soil quality. So instead of a plantation going for 60 or 70 years, but now taking 80 or 90 years to do, then that if you were valuing the stock of timber, then that would make a difference in terms of your projections of your asset life and those types of things. So there's certainly a crossover, and it's certainly been a fascinating discussion in the revision of the S&A, because we'll get to that later, I think.
Do you then also see that the environmental as an individual resource, like the data that you have on that, is also an input for measuring ecosystems?
It should be. Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, the health of a river or a lake, one indicator of that might be the quantity of fish. You might want other indicators as well, or it could be a water quality indicator. Will tell you something will flow through of water. So you will find, and that it's actually been quite a point of discussion that we need to build out further about how in actual fact the information for a given location, for a given time period, you should be able to crisscross it. You need to tell a common narrative. You can't just say, well, I'm going to use this ecological information over here to use forests, and then when I'm doing timber, I'm going to use this other production statistic. But if they're telling a different story, then there's not much. So conceptually it should be connected. You then get into the question of data sources and methods and all sorts of other things. But conceptually, for the same location, same time period, you should be telling a connected story.
Stop the ecosystem accounting at the national boundary because rivers will often be in 2 or 3 countries, wetlands. So.
That's a good question. I mean, the short answer in practice is yes.
Only to the national boundary.
Yeah, but at the same time, in the same way as the S&A deals with the economic system crossing boundaries, and you have a whole BPM to look at those flows between things. The water accounts, for example, would capture flows between countries. So for one country, you would say this is how much. So if you were doing accounting for the Nile, you would say, well, this much was at the, I don't know, was it start Ethiopia, somewhere like that. Anyway, as it goes north, you would say it comes in, goes out, comes in. If you had all of the accounts, you could pick up those boundaries. So, again, like the S&A, the SEER is aspatial. So all of the S&A, we could apply S&A principles to measure the economy sitting in this room. We don't because we don't think it's a pretty meaningful thing to do, but we could. We use the same framework to measure the GDP of Tonga as we do for the US. So it's not a question of size or complexity. We use the same principles, and SIA operates the same way. You could do it for a national boundary, but you could do it for lots of countries. You could do it for a little part of a country. It's just a question of the choice of resources that you have and what question you're trying to answer.
More information on this cross-border.
Where could you find more information? That's for water. I would go to the SIA water.
Okay, so it's all in the SIA.
I think, it's a good question. Essentially, what you're asked to do at the beginning of any accounting exercise is say what your geographical boundary is. That's the first thing you have to do. So you could set your boundary in different ways and get a different set of accounts. The SIA doesn't say what you should, which one you do. It basically suggests that you should do it nationally because it's sort of focused on that level of government. But there's no reason why you can't apply the principles.
Are we having something like BPM to see?
Yeah, not for environment, no. So if you,
BPM doesn't recognise the cross-border flows as you would like it, is what you were referring to in CF.
But I think over time, because the BPM has been created also linked to the SNA, I think the question you're raising is indeed very relevant. So the exchange between countries also in the area of ecosystems will become more important. And I think looking at the, for example, trade asymmetries between countries, country A is exporting to country B, but that's not resembles what country B reports as imports. I think in the end, we will see similar things once the SIA ecosystem accounting becomes more important. No?
yes and no, because in actual fact, most of those sort of that, like footprint type of analysis, when you say, well, I've got these, I'm going to say wooden chairs, but we don't have wooden chairs. Where did the timber come from? And that whole supply chain traceability sort of story. That's not an issue for the SIA. That's an issue for BPM and national. So the question of imports and exports of environmental things which are embodied will generally be the way that it happens. So you basically, the accounting you're doing in each of these is about a particular location. Most of water is a slight exception, but so there is a sort of a boundary issue that we probably need to talk about a little bit further, but it was a big confusion in the ecosystem services story. So there's a particular section in the SIA ecosystem account to talk about imports and exports of ecosystem services. And by and large, they don't happen. They happen in two particular cases. One where you've got international visitor flows. So someone from I come to the UK and I experience nature in the UK. I get a benefit. That's an export of a service by the UK and an import of an ecosystem service by me because of the residency sort of story. And then you have it's fishing, essentially. So because fishing production is always really annoying. So if you've got a flagged vessel of one country and they fish in someone else's waters, then that's an ecosystem service from the capture location to the flagged vessel's country. But that's really the only point that it happens. Because if I go to Sweden and cut down a tree, well, let's assume I'm a forestry company and go there, I would become a resident unit. I mean, there's an interesting question about what to do with illegal logging that I steal and take it over the boundary border. But putting that aside, it's always a problem. If I set myself up to mine or harvest resources within a particular country, that resource is there. And so that ecosystem service stays in that country. Because that ecosystem service is happening at the point. Now, if the timber moves countries, then it's just in your normal trade data. So the ecosystem service itself is a transaction that happens at a location. So,
Carl, I'm really sorry to ask
You're
this
right.
question, but it's a burning question. Carbon, okay, carbon storage, carbon sequestration. So I'm a Canadian. We've got lots of trees.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to measure the ecosystem asset of carbon storage, let's say, let's assume that that asset originates in Canada. The ecosystem is in Canada.
The ecosystem in Canada,
Storage is occurring in Canada. But the benefits of that would presumably accrue all over the world. Like the same thing for the Brazilian rainforest, you know, like.
Yeah.
So is there a,
We follow national accounts in the same way as the US defense system protects us all.
yeah, okay, it's a global public.
It's a global public good that we attribute to the country that undertakes where the service happens.
And we say we have to be very clear about that, because when we tell the story about where that asset is, the benefit is not going necessarily to the country that houses the asset.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's the way
That-
I characterize it.
That's just a large scale story of the whole of ecosystem accounting.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yes, exactly. But yeah, so for in the World Bank, for example, in communicating in the changing world of nations, that's a really important story for us to be able to tell in terms of a global database, right?
Yeah. You'll notice a formula down the bottom here that says assets plus resources, asset and resources plus ecosystem. We're not going to get rid of that thing. Equals a CR. That's a coverage thing. It's not an additive thing. Because just as we were talking about this link between, you know, in this case, timber and forests, there's information in here that will replicate information over here. So you can't just do a simple addition. It's actually one of the challenges in the drafting of the SNA. I'm going to leave that for another story. The lovely thing about the SEER is it's really a family. It's just quite remarkable. So we've got two here at the sort of at the core of the conceptual framing. But in actual fact, the first one that was released was SEER Water. So there's about 60 countries in the world, I think, that do water accounts. So SEER Water was released in 2010, I believe. SEER Energy is coming along. So that was great. That was it took a long time to get it. So 2013, 14. SEER for Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries was released in, was sort of completed around 2016, 2017. And we're sort of doing work. There's a lot of work on ocean accounting. There's raised before measuring sustainability of tourism. Thank you, John, which we just finished, got adopted as an international standard in March of this year. The accounting for biodiversity is a little bit not moving as quickly, but nonetheless. So there's lots of stuff going on. There's some technical recommendations. There was another book that was written in 2013 called Applications and Extensions to give you a sense of how you might use it. And probably needs updating, but nonetheless. So the SEER is very much an idea that it's got a lot of different pieces to it. Yes?
Question. In terms of what you described there, I get all that. The question is, where do you draw the line? The atmosphere and space. Do you see them as external? Not externalities, but external to this. Space and the atmosphere.
Only to the extent that of the question about, you know, where is it national, where the boundary. There's no reason why you couldn't do, although we'd have to develop it further, a SEER-based accounting for the atmosphere. In theory, that's fine. Indeed, I think there's quite a bit of discussion going on at the moment that it will be recognised as another ecosystem type, which is one of those things. But where you draw the boundaries for the atmosphere is quite an interesting thing. But the same would go for the high seas, those areas outside the exclusive economic zone. So most of the time we try and recommend that your SEER accounts would go out to the edge of your exclusive economic zone. That'd be the geographic boundary that you would use, so 200 nautical miles. There's a lot of area outside of that. And in theory, you could do ocean accounts for the world using the same principles. But who's responsible for that and who would do that is interesting question. But so they're out of scope. They're excluded from the central framework on the grounds that basically, remembering that the central framework is looking at individual bits, not the system. So the individual bits of the ocean, if you're measuring the oceans, is just the volume of water in the ocean. And everyone agreed, well, I mean, why would we bother? Well, it's going to be a very big number. Is it changing? Probably not. And it's the same with the atmosphere. It's just a lot of stuff. And so when you just think about it in purely quantitative terms, it's just very hard to imagine how you would do why you would do the count. But on the ecosystem accounting side, it brings in a different story. So this is the way I like to break up so obviously there are four basic things that you're covering in the SEER: environmental flows, natural resources, environmental transactions and ecosystem assets and services. This one's sitting in ecosystem accounting manual. Natural resources, this is basically overlaps directly with the SNA in the sense of the way the SEER Central Framework was written was designed to complement completely SNA principles in terms of valuation and scope. The only difference is that the SEER tackles it from the question of accounting for a particular asset type, whereas the SNA tends to focus on whether it's which economic units are involved, and that creates a sort of a slightly different framing for the accounting. Environmental transactions are also completely SNA compliant in the sense that every transaction that's included in environmental transactions is already recorded, at least conceptually, within the SNA framework. Expenditures on environmental protection, expenditures on natural resource management, environmental taxes, environmental subsidies, royalty payments for accessing natural resources. All of those things should all be recorded in the SNA. What the SEER does is draws those out and says, okay, well, which ones of all taxes, which ones are we going to call environmental? Of the subsidies, which ones are we going to call environmentally related? And tries to put some bounds around that. It's a purpose-driven view of the national accounts. Environmental flows is the one which is focusing on physical sort of flows of individual things, so water, energy, emissions, waste, and tries to give you a track. Sort of picking up on the question before, there are links between all of these things. They are separate accounts, but probably one slide to look at. Can be bothered afterwards. So we talked about timber resources and the links to this is mineral resources and environmental royalties should be linked. So if you're in the natural resources account measuring how many minerals you've extracted, it should somehow be related to the environmental transaction in the payments of royalties by a miner to the government. And the timber resources fish should link to ecosystem services where you're harvesting, provisioning services where you're extracting them from the carbon stocks and greenhouse gas emissions. So all of these things, so conceptually, all of these things should link together. How well we can do that in practice is another question, but that's the framing that's sort of inherent in the design of both documents.
Can you just ask another question? Obviously on the SNA, one of the principles is the change of economic ownership. Whereas I always interpreted the SEER would also focus not on that, but the physical movements.
Yep.
Is that something that is a bridge that links the two, or how do you perceive that's being brought together?
It depends which bit you're talking about. I mean, in a sense, these environmental flows are not really owned. You've got the water that's flowing. Or the energy that's flowing. So I guess you could talk about it in that way, but it's perhaps a little bit trickier. Because these are, ownership, I guess, is something associated with assets as opposed to transactions. So when you're talking ownership, you're going to be looking at what's happening with natural resources, and that's perhaps part of the difference. So the SEER doesn't look at the question of ownership. It basically says, this is how many timber resources or mineral resources we have.
Irrespective of who owns it.
Irrespective of this, what's the total stock and how's it changed? And that question of ownership is the one that actually creates the tension, because the SEER is happy to include things which do not satisfy an SNA definition of economic ownership. By and large, the conclusion there is that you include them in the physical stock, they essentially have zero value from an SNA point of view, and they have zero value from a SEER Central Framework point of view as well. The valuation scope is identical. Physical scope of the SEER is potentially broader. Depending on your country, how many instances of that you have is sort of variable. Land is sort of the more obvious one. But national parks, whoever brought that up, is an interesting case. Although national parks wouldn't be captured in natural resources anyway, because you've got no harvesting. So you've got no future value that's coming from it. So it's not included in the SNA and it's not included in the SEER Central Framework. But it will be included in the ecosystem account.
But it generates a benefit, happiness.
Yeah, well, that's not in the SNA, is it?
Yes, a good point.
I mean, except when you get a nice feeling when a good set of numbers comes out.
Yeah.
So when we talk about physical flows, it's just a quick, the key aim in accounting for physical flows is twofold. One is, the main one is to record the flows between the environment and the economy. So we're trying to say, well, how much does the economy either take from the environment or release into the environment? So you've got a two-way possibility. For some flows, you can really only record one direction, like emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions are really going out. Air pollution. The two big ones are water and energy. And they're ones that, if you put it in a common unit, well, water is sort of fairly obvious, it's sort of cubic meters. You can track it into the economy, around the economy, and back out again. So that's the theory, is you've got a single unit going through. With energy, everything gets converted into joules, and so you can measure the amount of energy you're extracting from the environment, how much is flowing around within it, and how much is going out again across a range of energy product. I didn't start my career in national accounts with supply news tables. We had every now and then in Australia, in the ABS, we used to do a input-output table, but they were a little group of people who sat off in the corner and no one paid them much attention. I was doing quarterly national accounts and got on with things. And then we had not a change of heart, a breakthrough, and said, right, we need to do supply use table balancing. I think Charlie Aspen went around the world, said, right, everyone's doing it, time to do it here. So after the last 10 or 15 years of working in environmental accounting, I cannot sing the praise. I'm a complete convert. The power of a supply and use table is just stupidly strong. It's stupid. And my experience, in actual fact, over the last 6 months of supporting Saudi Arabia for implementing their SEER accounts, so it's doing water, energy, land, and agriculture. And the learning that they're trying to get, they already had a lot of energy statistics, as you might imagine, for Saudi Arabia. But they've now worked, the person I'm working with has now understood, so I've got a gap there. Why doesn't that add up? So that there's, it's really quite, I'm a massive fan. So
Rob Edwards, Charlie Aston, and I can't remember his first name, Davies, but 3 Australians who came to the UK and took 40 pages plus of diagrams and implemented more stuff than we did in the UK. So there's irony there.
In about 2 years.
Yeah,
it's crazy. So this is your basics supply and use table. If you did a standard economic one, you just focus on, ignore this environment column and only focus on the products. We've got a supply of products and you've got a use of products. And that would be, so what does the SEER do? The SEER does, the big thing it does, it says, right, I'm going to add on another source, essentially, of flows, and that's going to be the environment. And I'm also going to call these things which are flowing in and flowing out other things. So I'm going to call the ones coming in, I'm going to call them natural inputs, and the ones going out are called residuals. It's important to know that the term residuals here is not pejorative. It doesn't mean good or bad. It's just stuff going out. So, and it's the same with natural inputs. It's not saying anything good or bad about what's coming in. It's just an accounting, right? This is what we just had to give it a label. So there's a number of steps that you go through. I think it's probably best to think about something like water or energy in order to get this through, because that helps. So you've got water that's coming from the environment and it's extracted by someone. So there has to be the key bit with supply and use is there has to be a pair. Every transaction has to be a pair, which really annoys people, including the SEER water people. And the SEER water, it's a really annoying document because they didn't quite. Anyway, nonetheless, putting that aside, so that has to be extracted by someone. Let's say it could be a farmer, could be a water company, could be anyone. So we've got different industries that would extract it. And then once it's done, then the person who's the company or organisation that's extracted it has some output because they're sending it to other places. So that's when this becomes a product. Then it's either for intermediate use in the production of other things, household consumption, potentially gross capital formation, but probably not for water. It could be exported. You could get your water from somewhere else as well. by way of example, that could be bottled water. So bottled water from one country to another would be an import, and that would notionally come into your water balance. Or conceptually come in, not notionally, conceptually would come in. Once you've had so this is the next stage, going from the economy back out to the environment, we've recorded this already, your intermediate consumption, household consumption, capital formation, the exports are gone, you could generate some residuals. And those are flows back into the environment. And again, we need a supply of the residual. So who created the residual? Could be by industry, could be by households. This is obviously a very generic one, but if we're thinking of water, it's going to be one of these two. And it has to go somewhere. So the water will go into here. You could imagine that we had some water treatment that happened. So your wastewater then goes from here, comes into the a wastewater treatment plant, which is a different industry. So then we go through the cycle again. The waste sort of story becomes quite a sort of everything going everywhere. But as long as you're imagining there's a supply and a use for every flow, and there's two units involved, then the whole thing can come to a nice balance.
I'll just add one thing that's really important. If you start with the supply and use tables, the product breakdown is really important for environmental analysis. So, for example, you take the energy industry, electricity, you've got the generation, distribution, transmission, etc. They're all doing different things. Luckily, water tends to be a standalone product, but you still need the supply and the sewerage to be separate. I wouldn't recommend mixing the two for obvious reasons, but never mind. Yeah. But the product breakdown provides a powerful linkage.
The general story is that, at least for water and energy, but also for air emissions, the data to do physical flow accounting largely exists. The challenge is actually converting it into a common framework. So in actual fact, because but most of that data doesn't necessarily apply a supply use type of framing. And so you've got to then try and work out how you balance things. Or you've got a product differentiation that's different from one they're using in the national accounts. So it's that ability, or the industry dimension is different. Energy accounts, your industries are based on sort of type of activity, not an ISIC classification. If you look at the International Energy Agency energy balances, there's one transportation, which you might imagine is that, but it's actually any use of energy for transportation by any industry is what they're covering, whereas that's not particularly helpful from a national accounts alignment point of view. So the idea is to try and match it to the structure you've got in your national accounts, so you can then start doing analysis across the monetary and the physical.
Just one quick question about the residuals. All the examples that I see, is it very much a story about recycling, or
it can be both. So there is a recycling story that can sit in here, but at the end of the day, there is this residual flows to the environment. So at some point in the process, there'll be some release of things to the environment. And that's actually quite an interesting, the sort of circular economy sort of story. What you're trying to change in a sense is how much goes back out and how long it takes to go back out there, and whether you can reuse it in here.
Throw a plastic bottle in the Thames, it will be on the... Yeah. Wasn't planning on doing that though.
We've got our eyes on it.
What is the unit of the?
It will vary depending on the flow that you're looking at. So in physical terms, the main thing is that you use the same unit for supply and use. So for water, it's often in cubic meters. For energy, it's the standard is joules or megajoules, petajoules.
It's not money.
It's not money, no. But you can, there is, particularly for these product flows, if you've got water flowing from the water supply industry to other industries, or electricity flowing to other industries, you're imagining that there should be a reasonable alignment between the expenditure on those, on that product and the physical flows of that product. And this is essentially, it becomes a check of whether or not that's working or not. And it is quite a significant
So the input and the output may not be the same.
No, you need to, well, what you've got to do is try and measure the unit the same. So that if I'm supplying water from a water supply company to a farmer, then I need to measure that flow in cubic meters for both sides. Now, if you're collecting the data differently from each side, then you would need to find some common unit to be able to do it.
To produce some crops, so that won't be cubic meters.
No, but that will be a different product. Remember, and that's the key with supply and use tables is the power of the product and tracing the product. And if you do that, it's easy to get ahead of yourself in the supply and use space. But yeah, if you can stick on the product and keep on going there, you can get some really insightful things. Okay. We've had a bit of a chat about this already, and it's not really a focus. This is a particular, I think it will become more of an issue. It was actually one of the big shifts that happened. I said the 1993 SEER focused on adjustments to GDP. From that point onwards, for the next 15 years or so, the switch shifted. It all shifted to physical flow accounts that we just discussed and some work on accounting for environmental protection expenditures. And actually, the original work for that was done in the US in the early 70s, I think, on environmental protection expenditures. So, yeah, you had this switch away from adjusting GDP. Well, no, we're not going to do that. We're just going to focus on the physical flows and the transactions we already know about. But it went in, everyone found it really, really hard. It was difficult to try and collect data without any resources to find out how much a particular firm had spent on environmental protection as distinct from total expenditures. So people came up with lots of different methods to try and get it together, but it was just hard work. And what has happened, I think, is now people are starting to realise, in actual fact, in understanding the response to environmental challenges, we need to know the magnitude of the effort that's going in. And so they're starting to get much more push behind that. There'll be a paper next week on climate change related expenditures, not financing, climate change related things. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of all countries in Europe have legal requirements to report on environmental tax and subsidies, environmental protection expenditure, the environmental goods and services sector. Not this one, but yeah. So in the EU, it's been much more of a focus of legal requirement to account here. It's not as common in the rest of the world.
Now, everything except for resource management. For some reason, they can't get that into law.
Resource rent.
Remeda.
The natural resource use. Yeah. No, so yeah. But I don't want to try and.
On that bottom point,
yeah,
that is quite important, even in the EU, in terms of government finance statistics. There's information required under regulation.
Yeah. Okay. It's not a big feature of the SEER because essentially we're just repeating what will be in the SNA. We're not saying anything different. Environmental assets. So that was a definition. If you think back to the definition of natural capital from the Natural Capital Protocol from slide number 3 or 4, this naturally occurring living and non-living components of the earth is essentially the stock, creates the biophysical environment, and then that may provide benefits to humanity is the flow. Right, so that's the definition. A lot of wordsmithing going on in here. Key point is it has a fundamental physical definition. It's not defined from an economic ownership type of S&A perspective, but also is the word may. And that was, that then allows the physical accounting to be broader than the monetary accounting. So if there are no benefits, it still could be an environmental asset. Okay, so it might have zero value from an S&A point of view, but so that's how that came together. This is the focus of the work was on describing accounting for all of these. In a sense, it just does it in more depth than the S&A, but the definition of these things is basically the same, except for land. When most economists think of land, they combine they're just thinking about the sort of areas. So land and soil basically go together. Now, in the CS Central framework, I've pushed a strong barrier. I managed to get it through to separate land and soil. So you can look at soil resources and the depletion of soil resources, loss of topsoil or those sort of things, as just a singular type of asset. The land was then defined as being space. Okay, purely its qualities as space where things happen, to paraphrase. And that's not how the SNA sees the world. And at some point down the track, it's already been part of a challenge when you look at the treatment of forests and timber resources in the new SNA. But that distinction, I think that treatment of land in the CS Central framework is really, really helpful. Because it just gives you this notion that you've just got a space and it could be used for lots of different things over time. And you can account for that space and how it changes.
Well,
yes, Josh.
You're now calling it environmental assets. And I thought before we called it natural capital. What is the difference, or are those interchangeable?
In this context, they're interchangeable. Essentially, it was I think I might have alluded to it, that when the term was discussed, we did have a discussion about whether we call it environmental assets or natural capital.
Yeah.
And essentially, the balance of opinion at the time was that we don't want to use the word capital from a statistical point of view because it has all these connotations associated with it. So we're going to go with assets. And the natural bit was a bit more confusing because there's some things which are environmental assets which are produced. We'll get to that in the next slide, I think. So included in the scope of environmental assets are plantation forests and livestock. So, and the question of whether they're natural is an open question. So there are a couple of arguments against natural capital at the time. So we settled on environmental assets. You've got to make a choice at some point. And it's kept going. It's just that essentially the rest of the world no one's picked up on the term environmental assets. One of the key points, though, is actually it's not in this slide. It's a bit annoying. It's a very old figure. But I just wanted to highlight that this definition of environmental assets includes ecosystems. Ecosystems fall under this definition of environmental assets. It just goes that two sides of the coin type of discussion. When you do CS Central framework, you're looking at environmental assets from this individual side of things. When you're doing it from a ecosystem accounting point of view, you're looking at it from a more systemic point of view. But the definition of environmental assets is the same in both cases. So that overlap is really the key point of this slide. There are quite a lot of environmental assets, natural capital, and I would use them interchangeably, I guess. So that are produced, non-produced, that are within the scope of the SNA, and the CIA is measuring those. And this, it's perhaps slightly out of proportion, this diagram. The valuation scope of environmental assets in the CS Central framework is limited to this intersection point. So even though there's a lot more physical assets that assets might record in physical terms in the CS Central framework, they're not included. The values are not included in the CS Central framework. We've got land in the middle of nowhere, or that doesn't generate an asset doesn't generate a benefit flow following the SNA. Then it's also that value is also excluded from the CS Central framework.
The value, but the physical
bit is in. Yeah. An asset account. There's actually a grid here. But essentially, you've got this is asset accounts in the SNA and in the CO. Essentially, you've got an opening stock at a point in time. Additions to the stock for a range of reasons that they might turn up, reductions in stock, and it includes things like catastrophic losses that might, as a result of a storm or extreme event, in the same ways catastrophic losses would be treated as another change in volume in the national accounts. There are some reclassifications and other things going on there, discoveries of stock, and then you have That works in physical and monetary terms. All of those entries, when you do it in monetary terms, you would also have a revaluation component where your stock, the value of your opening stock and your value of your closing stock is different purely because of a change in the price of the resource. So you would include that under the revaluation part.
So the quality improvement that was asked earlier, is that the reappraisal or is that revaluation?
It could be. It's a question of how you deal with, how you best deal with quality. So one way of dealing with quality is to just divide things up into smaller and smaller segments. So you could have coal of good quality and bad quality, and if you had different columns, you would in effect reflect the quality by breaking it down into smaller parts. But no, in a sense, it's not explicit. It's not explicit in that sense. If you just had coal as a total, then discoveries of new stock would be total coal, and you wouldn't be making an adjustment for the quality. Not in the physical accounts. Like the only way you can do it in the physical accounts is break it out into different qualities of the stock. In the monetary accounts, you would like to assume that the prices that you had were adjusted for quality. So if you had bad coal, you have a lower price. If you had good coal, you got a different price. Coal's probably a terrible example.
That might be a stupid question, but
No such thing.
okay. Just I mean, yeah. So if there's a land where a forest is located, are we also counting this land as a part of land that's available, or I mean the reason
As
that
distinct from
the reason that I'm asking this is like, if there is deforestation and then, some of the forests are lost and there is more land, then, maybe, this kind of a difference cannot be caught because if we, like one asset is going up while the other asset is going down. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And actually, it's at the heart of a really ugly, like technically ugly discussion in the National Accounts revision process. But
Literally right now.
The good news is the seer has it sorted. So the seer would say, okay, because land is conceptualized as space, if you take a given area, you can split it up you can characterize that space in different ways. One is by the different uses that are made of the land. One might be the land cover. It might be land ownership or tenure. So there's different ways you can break up that same space. So if you imagine, in this case, we're thinking about a use way of breaking up the space, then we could have, generally the use classifications align fairly well with activity in ISIC. So we'd have forestry, agriculture, built up areas, which is not, particularly ISIC, but, and so if you get a situation where, so the key point in the C is that because the physical doesn't need to equal the monetary, you start from the outer edge to begin with. So you're naturally constrained in your account. So when you do your opening and closing stock, if you've got different, imagine columns here for agriculture, land, urban, this bottom right-hand corner is fixed from opening to closing. I mean, there are exceptions, but putting that aside, land reclamation projects or something like that. But assume that the bottom corner is fixed, then all you're trying to do is manage, okay, well, at one point in time, how much area do I have for agriculture? How much do I have for forestry? How much do I have for urban? Get the total. You do it at the bottom, and then you can start doing how each one has changed. So you should pick up that sort of change in deforestation. The problem that comes is then a methods question, and there's a lot of classification questions, and forests in particular is pretty messy. But yes, so you should pick up that. There are things called land cover change matrices, which allow you to look at, and if you've got information that works not at sort of a national level, but if you've got spatial data that allows you to look at every area within your broad total, and you can say at the opening and closing what was it at the beginning and what was it at the end, then you can basically work through aggregates about what has changed from what to what, both good and bad, or up and down, I should say, not good and bad.
What I do hear you say is because you use like a common accounting unit, so like available land area. For example, tropical rainforests are known for bad soil quality. And I assume like if you burn a bit down, and start to cultivate land, you actually improve the soil quality. So how do you deal with it when you have different account use? Because we got tree coverage loss, we got biodiversity loss, but topsoil increase.
Yeah, this is about the hardest question in ecosystem accounting. It's relatively easy for the central framework because the central framework is saying, well, that switched from forest to agriculture. And then I'm going to measure my soil resources over here. And my soil, I could classify them as, this goes to the quality question. I could say, I'm going to have different qualities of soil, and it was this quality at the opening, and it was not the open. So you just track that. But because you're tracking the change in the land area and the change in the soil resource separately, you sort of see a central framework sort of avoids the bigger question. In ecosystem accounting, it is really problematic, ecologically problematic. And indeed, the ecologists haven't quite couldn't agree on how they should deal with it. It's the type of question the accountants ask, which the ecologists get really annoyed about. Because it really is quite a challenge to be able to say, when does one ecosystem change from being one type to another? Because there is natural variability in ecosystems. So if you have a big bushfire that goes through a forest, that can sometimes be, it could be natural, whatever causes it. You might expect one every 10 or 15 years or so. And that will be a natural, and if you're using a measurement of vegetation cover, perhaps your vegetation cover has disappeared. You say, well, I don't have a forest anymore. I've got something else. So the accountant goes, right, I'll change it to bare land or grassland or something. And then it comes back again. But in actual, from an ecological point of view, that natural variation means that it hasn't changed ecosystem types over that whole time. It's still a forest. So, but that boundary between, the ecosystem conversions, how much of a loss in quality do you need in order for it to change ecosystem type it's a messy business, but
Good question. It's true. Forest land, agricultural land, I can see and understand the rationale. But what about where land is not separable? For example, in cities, towns, rural areas, and you've got buildings sitting on the land.
And separable from what?
The land and the building, the valuation is not separable.
There's the land and the tree.
So when you buy a house, you're buying freehold, the land and the building.
Yeah. Well, national accounts gets to separate.
Oh.
Produce capital and not produce capital.
Yeah, it's not always separable.
Badly, but we did it.
Yeah, we still estimate it. We allocate headquarter costs against.
Yeah.
It's just a
method question.
It's a method question. Well, it just brings up an interesting point. It's like any new thing coming in to the national accounts or any accounting system. The new things coming in always have to pass a more rigorous test than the things that are already in the door. Because the methods that are being used for doing produced capital stock at the moment, that's probably it's over harsh because people those assumptions have been checked and everybody uses basically the same ones. And if you're lucky, you might do a survey every now and then to try and check whether the depreciation rates are what you have. But basically, as long as you've got a gross fixed capital formation series, you're set. But somehow, because the national accountants are doing it, no one asks. And the same happens in corporate accounting as well. And then when someone comes along and says, how are we going to do these forests and whatever? The level of detail that the OECD expert group on natural capital is getting into is just phenomenal. It really is asking these really serious, good questions. But we need to sort of, And they're great to ask from a technical point of view. They're so fun. Whether anyone really cares about them is another question. Or whether it makes a difference to the decision you would make. It's actually a paper that I've been meaning to read for a long time, is whether or not you would get a very different estimate of productivity if you just applied this Salo method from 1950, the first one. I'm looking at you, Josh, because I'm hoping you know. When he used unemployment data, net capital stock, so none of the sort of the fantastic work on productivity. If you could estimate that method now based on the available data in national accounts. And I wonder whether it would tell you a fundamentally different productivity story from the one we have now. Yeah, it's been an intriguing question.
You're too afraid to look into that. We might be out of a job.
So now this is the really quick introduction to ecosystem accounting. You'll notice this figure of some sort, I can never remember which one actually went in the end, is in the CIA ecosystem accounting. Notice the nested system story. Critical point is the distinction between ecosystem assets, final ecosystem services. So these are conceptualized the way I prefer to do this, but it's not true of everybody who does ecosystem accounting. I like to see these ecosystem assets as separate producing units alongside your other businesses, your farmers, your water supply companies and others. So these, imagine in a sense, you've got a steward who's looking after that ecosystem and is managing transactions with the economy. And so, you know, in that supply use table we showed before, we added on a column for the environment. It's taking that a little bit further and saying, because what essentially exists in a supply table is you've got a whole lot of industries across the top as columns. And we added on one in this sort of central framework thing, just on the environment as an amorphous thing. And what we're saying now in ecosystem accounting, saying, oh, we're going to add in lots of different columns. And in actual fact, every one of those we're going to think of as a supplier. Now, who managed it? And putting aside the ownership question, because we'll come back to that later. But essentially, that's how I contextualize it. We're creating this, they're supplying it. They produce, so it could be a forest, it could be a wetland, whatever, producing final ecosystem services, which generates benefits. So the distinction here between final ecosystem services and benefits is very important. This bit, the final ecosystem service, is what the ecosystem, the input of the ecosystem, the contribution of the ecosystem. The benefit is what we receive at the end of the day. Now, sometimes they're the same, but in a lot of cases, particularly agriculture or recreation, agriculture is a good example. We get ecosystem services. There's soil, water, nutrients, a whole lot of things that come in as ecosystem services, pollination. The benefit is the crop that's produced and harvested. So in order to get the benefit in an agriculture context, you need to combine your ecosystem contribution with other inputs in order to get to that benefit.
Carl,
Yeah.
question. Final here. When you say final, you mean that those ecosystem services don't contribute to other ecosystems? They contribute to, like they could be contributing to business, other units, like any unit.
Yeah.
Call the economy, or I don't know. We're not separating them, but
Oh, no.
this is what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
The final.
They're essentially transactions between my ecosystem as a producing unit, all ecosystems, and economic units.
And economic units.
Yeah.
Any economic.
Any economic unit. But conceptualizing this as a transaction is really quite at the heart of the story.
Exactly. Otherwise, how do you integrate?
How do you do supply use?
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. What happens if you don't pay for it?
Doesn't matter.
You get the benefit, but you don't.
Doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Sorry,
It doesn't mean it didn't happen. So we're talking physical terms here. So the transaction, it's not a transaction in the concept of a monetary transaction, but the SNA also allows non-monetary transactions, and you just put a value on them because you need to for accounting purposes. But it's actually the section on transactions in the SNA is really instructive in terms of applying it to the concept of an ecosystem service. And it's an adaptation, to be fair, but it's there. It's there. Okay, so we've seen this a little bit before, but this is a more stylized interpretation of that other larger figure. And essentially, this is the structure for the accounting. And we call it the 4-box model, even though we've decided to present it as circles. And when you do stocks, you have two things that you're interested in: extent and condition. So how big is the ecosystem? How big is your producing unit? And condition, your quality of your thing. And that combination is important. You need information on both to be able to tell a story about your stock. And then what are the services which are generated and what benefits do they contribute to? So, and ideally that sort of frames your set of accounts, which then look like this. So there are 5 core ecosystem accounts. There's stock accounts and there's flow accounts. The stock accounts, and there's physical accounts in the sort of lighter blue, and the monetary accounts in the darker blue. So extent and condition accounts. So they're obviously stocks, they're in physical terms. You've got your ecosystem services flow, supply and use table that's happening here in physical terms, going from the ecosystem into an economic unit of some sort. You can then put a price on that flow that converts the physical supply and use table into a monetary supply and use table. And then you can create an asset account, which is back into the stocks again, by looking at the changes in the ecosystem asset. So it's essentially the net present value of all of the flows that are being produced by that ecosystem or expected to be produced. So in the same way as you conceptualize an asset account for anything in the produced capital or human capital space.
Can I add a clarification here?
Sure.
And it's linked to, I think, the point you made earlier on. So when you have your supply and use tables, they're in current prices, and you can use prices to deflate that to generate them in volume terms. The price that you're referring to here is not the transition from physical to monetary. You see where I'm coming from? Supply and use tables in volume terms, not the same as the monetary tables that you're referring to here.
Not this. What do you mean by not the same as?
So the supply and use tables and current prices have been deflated just to take the price effect out, and you end up with a volume table in monetary terms.
In the national accounts.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true.
It's just making sure the term price in its use is delineated, because the tables in volume terms are still monetary tables, but they use prices for deflation. Whereas the prices here are generating monetary tables.
Yes.
The barrels of
That's
oil.
true, but I wouldn't want to be too restrictive on how that's interpreted.
Okay.
The key point for me is that for something to get into this physical supply use table or into the monetary one, there needs to be an observed interchange, transaction, connection, whatever word you want to use, between the environment, between an ecosystem and an economic unit. And that's observable, that you know it happened. Then it's a question of quantification. How much of it went between these two? Could I put a price on it? It might be that in actual fact you observe the monetary transaction before you observe the separately from the physical. So you're then in, and it's not, in a sense, it's the same as tracking flows of water. You observe a payment from a company to the water supply company, but you also observe a physical flow. The key point at the start is that it happened. There was an interchange. And then you start building an accounting system around those sets of transactions. Your choice of unit just, becomes sort of partly so there will be I guess it goes to the point, if you did a deflation approach to get your a volume supply and use table, you would like to think that it was telling the same sort of story as if you'd gone directly to the quantification. And I guess if you're using quantity revaluation in your deflation approach, then you should be the same. So I think it in that sense, the C Essential Framework and ecosystem accounting provide a richness by thinking about both the monetary and the physical at the same time. And that's what's often lost. I think, and that's why there's this potential for interplay between the SEER accounts and the national accounts, because you're trying to, these things are happening. It's just, can we agree on how we're classifying the things and which ones happen between who and all that sort of stuff? Because I have a sort of belief that you're looking at one world. It's not like there's, just taking different takes on it.
Can I ask, I'm struggling a bit with the biodiversity, how it fits into things, because it was in one of your earlier slides. And then I was wondering, is biodiversity, because it might affect the species, so the individual, so it has an impact there, but it's not a separate ecosystem thing. It's affecting conditions or.
Yeah. We should have done a slide on biodiversity. So the story is that first, it's important to understand that there's different types of biodiversity. biodiversity is looked at in different ways. There's, and this is coming from the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. So you've got the diversity of ecosystems, diversity of species, and diversity of genes. So there's three levels that you want to, for different reasons, you want diversity, because diversity gives you a level of resilience and redundancy in the system, so that if you start losing bits of it, you want to know whether or not your ecosystem or your species will still function. So in effect, then what we do from an accounting point of view is we treat each of them separately. So if you wanted to, but we don't directly include a biodiversity measure. So measures of diversity, and you could do this as well for industries, or that use the same maths in actual fact. Diversity of supply chains or diversity of whatever. You have to pick a thing so from an accounting point of view, what is the thing that you're looking at the diversity of? So when you want to talk about ecosystem diversity, you're basically doing an extent account, organizing information on the area of all of the different ecosystems you have, and then deriving an index, which is a measure of the diversity of that set of ecosystems at that point in time. So you could track, using the accounting information, you could generate. So a species account then becomes essentially the same sort of story. You could get all the species and put them across and get a diversity of species. You could do the same for genes, conceptually. The real point is that, then where that information on species generally comes to play is in the ecosystem condition account. So if you've got accounts of different species and where they're living in, if you're trying to tell a story about the condition quality of an ecosystem, you'll pick up information on species generally.
So if my number of species is dropping, the condition of that ecosystem is going down, and the value of that ecosystem.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Because it won't be the only, it's not
more
sparrows.
Yeah.
So, but then you need to link the other discussion that happens in biodiversity is biodiversity a service? So now what I would say is that if you say that biodiversity is actually a change in the stock, whether it's of ecosystems and whatever, it's a measure of how that's changing, then it's sitting in here. And that biodiversity measurement is sitting in this sort of change in stock. Whereas a lot of people confuse the word service with outcome. So it's quite useful to have increasing biodiversity, more ecosystem condition and whatever. But just because it's a positive thing and a good thing and what we're aiming for doesn't make it a service flow. And so we've been fairly specific that biodiversity is not a service flow. There's no transaction in biodiversity. So the only place it becomes relevant then is that if you're looking at, say, something like recreation services provided by forests, maybe more people, or a coral reef is a better example, maybe more people go to a coral reef because there's a diversity of fish and plant life that's there. And so if you are measuring the service flow from the ecosystem to the scuba diver, you would take into account, one of the things you might have in a model of service flow might be the diversity of species that's in that place. So it becomes an input. Pollination is another great example. Your range of pollinator species might be a key parameter in estimating how much the flow of pollination services is going on.
What about non-use value?
Yeah. So
if you're coming to this later, then
I will
defer it.
I will, in actual fact, because it comes up well in the discussion of valuation. But we did have a long discussion about that. Right. This was a discussion.
Let me ask another question.
Too many for one morning.
Yeah, sorry. No, I just was, because I've been puzzling over this in the project that I've been working on at the World Bank, where we're trying to integrate wealth values on ecosystem assets with economic values. And in the national accounts, when we're looking at wealth change, and this is something that people are really struggling to understand about, what do these comprehensive wealth tables mean? We can separate that if we were to compile a complete set of wealth accounts. We can separate the wealth change into an investment or a transaction component, or revaluation and other volume change. Do the SIA ecosystem accounts have an equivalent to that? I think you showed specific components, right? Like revaluations or conversions, or these kinds of things. Degradation, would that be like, that would be a wealth change, would it not?
Yeah. So that's essentially the structure of your monetary asset account. Excuse me. it's generally framed in terms of additions and reductions, as opposed to a investment, other change in volume,
The
because
language is different, but you could.
the structure is different. And it's because the ecosystem accounting doesn't have a produced, non-produced sort of story going on.
And
We're just talking about a change in the stock. So increases in stock, you can look at different ones and why they changed, and reductions of different ones, but you're categorizing it that way rather than
And the stock is always an accumulation of benefits, like
in value terms.
in value terms. In value terms, it's always an accumulation of benefits rather than measuring an asset. Like it's because you could have ecosystem assets that produce multiple benefits.
Yes. In an evaluation sense, yeah, you have to look at that complete benefit package bundled.
Because you'd always be valuing a package of services.
Yeah. I mean, you could potentially just do one.
Right. And you could say
Yeah.
that's the asset for carbon sequestration services.
Or if you wanted to align with the S&A, you just pick one which is sort of linked to, timber resources, for example. That could be an ecosystem service, will be a resort in concept, which would be resource rooms. Is how you value the timber resource from that particular forest.
Yeah.
There's a lot. I don't know. I've actually never counted them up. Probably should. And what that means is that no one does them all. It comes back to the point that you need, it's back to that, what is the role of accounting? The role of accounting is to get some sort of more coherent data set about what's going on so that everyone can use the same set of information. And so the ones you pick should be the ones which are policy relevant in your case. So it could have changed, but my understanding is that Norway will never do water accounts. I just got so much water, it's just not worth it. It's not worth it. But if you're in Saudi Arabia, as I've been, water accounts are actually quite an important thing. So you want to focus on where you're putting your priorities on the things which are of particular issues in your context. And in that sense, SEER is just a family of accounts that you can choose from to be able to do. But conceptually, they've been designed to be.
Because to me, that is one of because I've been trying to get more insights in the SIA accounts. And for me, it's a lot of trees, and I don't see the forest for the trees. Maybe right terminology here. And I've been asking Bram, so who's leading the expert group on natural capital, where can I find the overarching? I just want a co-prac, or how do you say, to guide me through where to look for the relevant information. And like the S&A for me is, I go to the S&A and there are a lot of extended accounts, thematic accounts, but at least the S&A is giving me the overarching framework and is helping me to see the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
And for the SIA, there is the ocean account, and to me it's like, okay, but what is helping me to figure out the physical flows for this and the monetary flows, and then all of a sudden there is the residuals, and I'm getting lost. So I have the impression that it's because it is building up, and I'm still hoping that something is going to bring the stuff together so that I can get one overview that helps me to see the structure in all of it.
And a very related question to that is that any integration is always going to be very selective, right? Like it's never going to be a comprehensive integration or feasibly. I mean, I'm talking from a practical point of view.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah.
There is a table / figure in Chapter 2 of the SEER Central Framework, which everyone forgets about, and I've forgotten about it completely most of the time, which works towards that type of question. But it is definitely on the list of issues. So the SEER Central Framework is just about to commence a revision process to update it from 2012 to something like 2027. And so that's one of the issues on the radar. It has been a long conversation. I mean, the related question is a link between the central framework and ecosystem accounting. That's very poorly understood, in large part because the people working on the central framework and the people working on ecosystem accounting are two largely separate groups, and they were sort of developed independently, which is, I guess you can't change that. But so there is a need that umbrella thing. But in part, it's sort of, I would say, well, what did you want to know? But yeah, you're right. It's no good if we haven't got some way of showing how.
But in that sense, as you say, it's people working on ecosystem accounting, people working on the CIA central framework, people working on the SNA, and for me, I've been working on the SNA for quite a while now, and to me, the CIA, I'm always a bit scared to touch upon the CIA, and I think to bring those elements together, because that is what you need for the narrative and what you need for the users. So we probably need to do something that helps people to understand it across.
I do think it's still also a challenge in the national accounts. I mean, for a lot of people who know the national accounts as a system, but there's an awful lot of people out there who've got no idea that there's another change in volume on a balance sheet or all these sort of other things. So, but there is a design of a picture. So, yeah.
I think what might help you, and this is quite ironic what I'm about to say, because the Dutch used to leave this. There used to be something we called a NAMIA. Yeah, which is come and gone. And that provided the link, albeit in those days, I'm talking about 30, 40 years ago. I'm not that old, please. So I'm going to rephrase that. Yeah. So NAMIA was one. And then the other thing is, linked to your question, the more accounts you have, how do you delineate or avoid duplication? Because they're all interlinked in many ways. So when you look at the environment, the sea, the ocean, the forests, etc., there's cycles that link them. So the more proliferation of the minutiae of the accounts, how do you avoid? Because the sum of the accounts doesn't equal the total.
No.
It's not that easy.
Well, it comes down to that notion you've got a coherent data set, that there's some omnipotent person in the middle who's able to see how all this fits together. And I started my career in national accounts doing consumption expenditure numbers. So I do all these numbers, detailed benchmarks, and I send it off to someone, and then they come back a couple of days later and say, "Here, adjust this." But I don't know I didn't know the big picture until how it moves forward. I think it's a similar sort of story. You would like to think that the data sets which might be feeding into different accounts are all someone's thinking about it and saying, well, we don't need to collect that data twice. We can just put it in. But it's more an implementation challenge, I think, than a conceptual one. But we are left with the challenge, I think, of showing that all these things are connected. There is a really nice, as an example of how those connections are going, NAMIA, fell over in part because it was just this massive model of everything. And it was just too hard, in a sense, and didn't help people identify, I want data for a particular issue. So, well, you don't need to do the whole thing, so I think. But the Dutch have just recently released some ocean accounts, I think earlier this year, and they've introduced this idea of a pressure account, an ecosystem pressures account, which is essentially an addition to this set here, but it's looking at the flows of residuals that you would measure during the central framework, so pollutants to water. So you measure that flow, but it's actually seen as to what extent is it connecting to a change in ecosystem condition of the ocean. So instead of looking at and the difference is essentially a spatial one. In the sea central framework, where it goes in the environment, you don't care. It just goes for the environment. Whereas in an ecosystem mindset, you say, well, I actually care that my excess heavy metals are ending up down the beach, or my sewage is coming in here. So you can start to frame your sea central framework account for pollutants and residual flows linked to the spatial place where they're affecting things. There's still two separate accounts, but that potential for integration is very real.
Just made the point that for many countries, the decision to do a particular kind of account is mostly created by the economic or policy realities of that country.
Yeah.
And I get that we as accountants and scientists really like the idea of a coherent data set, but the point that I am getting is that's mostly the decisions are made what's policy relevant. And the question that I have is, why do you need a whole accounting system for that?
You don't. So all you need, I think it's important to realize that each account is coherent in and of itself. And so the fact that all of the accounts are also coherent doesn't mean you have to do all of the accounts. In the
I guess
there's the coherence test is at sort of at two levels. So your policy choice is I want to get if you got S&A, everyone just basically spend all your resources on the production account and your supply and use table, and so doing the other accounts is sort of it comes along, right? But the people who are designing the S&A said, well, I know you're spending all your time on the production account, but there are all these other ones and we've linked them all. So they're all coherent, but the production account itself is coherent. I think it's similar in the SEA context. You could pick any individual account and it's a coherent set of information about water or energy or ecosystems.
For me, at least, what I get from environmental policy, like the policy context, usually from, oh yeah, I'm interested in the biodiversity in this particular area, or I want to know how many fish there are in that river.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, why do we need accounting for that and not just hire a bunch of consultants to do the research and then move on?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in actual fact, I think it goes back to the point that I would like to think that for any individual environmental issue, pests or biodiversity or whatever, I would have data in order to manage that topic. I mean, water accounting is not telling the water managers anything they don't already know. So for any individual, but the point, and this goes back to the beginning of the day, the point is that at the moment, all of these themes are being managed independently. Biodiversity is being managed separately from pests, being managed separately from agriculture policy, being managed separately from water policy. And so they've all got their own individual data sets that are relevant for what they want to do. And you think, so accounts, and that's why the SEA Central framework has sometimes a struggle, because for any individual theme, well, I already know everything about forests. Why do I want an account? Or water, So in that sense, it's a hard sell to say accounting is a great thing. So, it is. So the point is that what we want to try and do is think about policy differently. And in order to think about policy differently, you say, well, in actual fact, what you do for climate change and biodiversity and water are all linked. And that means you should have a data set which says that are coherent across those themes. That's the motivation. The other one is that goes back to the other part about SEA, and its motivation was how to get that environmental data, independent of the policy uses for environment, how to get the environmental data into central banks and treasuries. That's the translation that's the most important one in a sense. So any individual account, if the treasury people start thinking, accounts for water, what a great, I've never had this information before. It's not that they couldn't have got it, because some of the hydrologists down the road have been doing water balances for 20 years, but they've now got it in a framing that makes more sense to them, and hopefully they will use it and bring water. So there's that sort of, maybe we can up the ante from the economics point of view. And that's in a sense the basis behind waves and wealth accounting and those things. How do we bring this and the revision in the S&A, how do we bring this non-core economic data into an economic framing such that people, it's not that it didn't exist, it's just that I haven't bothered about it. But seeing the policy question is really problematic. I mean, just to give an example, the biodiversity and pests sort of story. In most countries, the major driver of biodiversity loss are pests. Maybe land use change, but it's species coming in and killing off the other ones. But those two data sets, from an accounting point of view, are just measures of species. There's some we like, some we don't like. But from an accounting point of view, I don't really care. So I'm just going to have a species account that says I've got rats, pigeons, lions, and rhinoceros. And I'm not saying there's any link between those animals, but in an accounting sense, you just measure the numbers at the beginning, numbers at the end. And now if someone wants to use it for pest policy, or someone wants to use it for biodiversity policy, it's just the same information set and they're just pulling it out. But the fact one's good and one's bad is not, the accounting is sort of neutral on that call. But it's all species accounts, but the policy bit just goes separate. Probably about time to have a break, because now that it was meant to be the deeper dive, but we've done a lot of this already. I think I'm going to stop there, because when I get into this stuff, you'll just get more examples of the stuff we've just talked about. I mean, I've preferred it when you guys have asked questions. It's made it easier for me. But the slides that will come up now will perhaps hopefully reinforce some of the things, but I'll go through them a bit more quickly, and then we'll get on to valuation, because I think that's it's a fascinating topic. So, cool. Yeah, I'm assuming you're hungry. I think probably all need a break, at least from my voice. Yeah, I think we'll try and come back in an hour.